Salam alaikum, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast. Or should I say, Anakashim lu Shulmum, may you be well. Welcome to Canaan in the Late Bronze Age. This is episode 182b, Inglorious Amurrites. Today, we take a moment to go beyond the Egyptian borders. We are visiting a land called Amurru, part of modern-day Lebanon. Amurru and the Amurrites are an important part of regional politics during the Late Bronze Age. Between 1400 BCE, the age of Amunhotep III, and 1300 BCE, the age of Sety I, the kingdom of Amurru gained great prominence, and more than a little notoriety. This is a side episode. It deals with material that I think is interesting, but isn't 100% necessary for the big story. If you are just here for the main narrative, you can skip this. But if, like me, you enjoy going beyond Egypt's borders, this is a tale for you. This episode may appear unnecessarily long, but there is a reason for that. It includes new material, but also a compilation of previous episodes describing the Kingdom of Amurru. In episode 123, 124, and 142c, I have explained the rise and deeds of these people. I realize not everyone has the time or the inclination to go hunting for those individual chapters, so I have stitched those together as the second part of this episode. I'll put timecodes in the episode description if you want to jump around or get to specific chapters. But yeah, the first part of this episode is new content. Then we switch over to a compilation of Amurru's backstory. So if you're just here for the new stuff, the episode is not actually 3 hours long. Just thought I'd clear that up. Anyway, enough introduction. Let us travel outside of Egypt to the mysterious land of Amurru. The year was 1300 BCE, approximately. The Kingdom of Egypt and its people followed the leadership of Men-Ma'at-Ra, Sety I. Sety, in his mid-30s, was active in war. Previously, he had led campaigns against the Bedouin of the Sinai, rebels in Canaan, and the powerful city of Kadesh. One after another, Sety triumphed over his enemies, and he recorded his deeds on the walls of Karnak Temple. But that wasn't the end of his war reliefs. There is more. Sety's images at Karnak show the battle for Kadesh. We covered this in episode 182. Curiously though, the hieroglyphs of this scene mention another land involved in Sety's campaign. Above the battle, Sety describes his war as, quote, the ascent which Pharaoh, life, prosperity, health, made in order to destroy the land of Kadesh and the land of Amurru. That's intriguing. The battle scene only shows Kadesh. The fortified town and its army are the main focus. Why would Sety reference Amurru, an entirely separate land, in this text? The answer may lie just around the corner from these images. The Kadesh scene appears on the northern side of Karnak, the external wall of Sety's hypostyle hall. Originally, this building had 3 faces, 3 areas that Sety could decorate. Most of his battle scenes appear on the north face, the largest area. There are a couple on the eastern face, like the Shasu battle and the tree cutting in Lebanon. And there are images on the western face, just around the corner from Kadesh. Unfortunately, that western wall is no longer visible. A few centuries after Sety, another pharaoh made their own contributions to Karnak. They built new monuments to glorify the gods. In the process, builders erected walls in front of Sety's monument. As a result, the western side of Sety's battle reliefs has disappeared beneath a layer of stone. Scholars know that the scenes are there. We can even see a tiny portion of them. More on that in a moment. Alas, we cannot tear down the later wall just to see these images. The scenes are concealed, and they will remain so until technology advances, or some accident befalls the later monument. For now, here is what we know. The battle for Kadesh appears at the edge of Seti's hall, the corner of the building. Around that corner, on the western face, there are hints of another scene. The king's head is visible, wearing his blue crown. His right arm is pulled back, drawing the string of a bow. Clearly, he is in a fight of some kind, preparing to loose arrows upon an enemy. Which enemy? That is unknown. Because the scene is hidden by later masonry, we only have the top of the image. Add some erosion and general damage over the centuries, and all we can see is Sety, preparing to fire on someone. Who was he attacking? The most likely answer is Amurru. The land of the Amurrites was located north and west of Kadesh, near the Mediterranean coast, so it's in the same geographic region as the Kadesh scenes, around the corner on the building. And since Seti's imagery of Kadesh specifically references Amurru, maybe this trace of Sety firing arrows shows a battle in that region. If that is accurate, then what is the significance? Why would Sety devote a large image to the conquest of Amurru? For that matter, where is Amurru? Who is Amurru? Why is Amurru? Amurru was a region, or kingdom, in modern-day Lebanon. The land itself is hard to pinpoint exactly, but it seems to be located in the mountain range called Mount Lebanon today. That line of peaks runs north to south, parallel with the Mediterranean coast. The mountains are high, reaching 3,000 meters or 10,000 feet in some areas. And as you can imagine, these mountains get wet. Plenty of rain and snow falls across the region, especially in winter. As a result, Mount Lebanon and the Amurrite lands were heavily forested in antiquity. Conifers, or Lebanese cedar, would have covered this area. That made Amurru and its neighbors a pastoral land. Thick forests and mountainous slopes would make farming difficult, so the default industry would have been pasture, animal herding, grazing, and seasonal movement. With that in mind, Amurru probably wasn't a major centralized kingdom. What I mean is, the people likely made their livelihoods from animals and regular movement. All of that was fine for a good quality of life. Nomadism and pastoral movement can produce many of the products that humans need day to day, but that way of life is most effective if the land is isolated. Amurru was not. In fact, it had some powerful neighbors. The word Amurru roughly means west, or the western land. The term comes from Akkadian, a language that emerged in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. From the Akkadian perspective, the Mediterranean coast and Lebanon were western. The people who lived there slowly came to be known as Amurrites, or Westerners. That's a terribly brief summary. Hopefully the Akkadian linguists won't come for me, but it gives us a starting point. Amurru and the Amurrites were the cultural descendants of a much older tradition. Living in their mountainous land near the coast, they were the archetypal Westerners of this region. The early history of Amurru is vague. Archaeologists can identify traces of their society, artifacts and objects, but the kingdom itself and the people called Amurrites are mostly invisible. Scholars have identified texts that mention Amurru as far back as the 3rd millennium, 2000 BCE and earlier. But as far as written references are concerned, we don't hear much about Amurru for many, many centuries. That is, until the 14th century, the 1300s BCE. In that time, Amurru as a kingdom began to coalesce, and its leaders became renowned or infamous in foreign courts. I'll cover the rise of Amurru as a kingdom in Part 2, the early episodes that I stitched together. But just so we're all on the same page, here are the essentials that you need to know. Around 1360 BCE, give or take, a lord of Amurru named Abdi Ashirta started to gather followers, warriors, and he began to raid and pester his neighbours. Abdi Ashirta was an aggressive ruler, and with every victory, he managed to attract more and more followers to his cause. Subsequently, Abdi Ashirta's son, Aziru, inherited the kingdom, and he and his brothers went even further, expanding their borders and capturing local cities. The problem was that Amurru, officially, was a subject of Egypt, and many of the places that they were raiding were also the vassals of the pharaoh. As a result, Abdi Ashirta, Aziru, and their followers came into conflict with the Egyptian authorities. The story is long and complicated, but in the end, the Amurrites became a major force within their region, and before too long, they basically went rogue. The kingdom of Amurru formed its own independent state. They broke away from the Egyptian empire, and they started to make friends with Egypt's enemies. The rise of Amurru is a fascinating story, full of twists and turns, political deception, and constant battle. Over 50 years or so, between 1360 and 1310 BCE, the lords of Amurru slowly forged their kingdom. They were incredibly successful at what they did, and in that time, the Amurrites frequently came into contact, or conflict, with Egypt. From the reigns of Amunhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Horemheb, we get many hints of Amurru and their deeds. Again, we explore that in more detail in Part 2. For now, this is the basic setup. By 1300 BCE, the reign of Sety I, Amurru had formed a powerful state, and they had broken away from Egypt. Their rebellion and the process behind it is a fascinating tale, and it helps set the scene for King Seti's campaign. So our story begins in the 1300s BCE. In that time, pharaohs like Amunhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Horemheb ruled over Egypt. And from their reigns, we start to learn more about Amurru. The tale is complex, but intriguing. We know the general area of Amurru. The kingdom emerged in the Mount Lebanon region, but from the texts, like the Amarna letters, we don't get much specific information. The borders of the kingdom and its major centers are up in the air. Can scholars pinpoint things more clearly? The next part of our story is partly speculation, but it is based on science and archaeology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a scientific study examined letters sent by the Amurrite leaders. The lords of Amurru dispatched messengers to many of their contemporaries. That included the pharaohs of Egypt. They carved these letters on clay tablets, and these tablets survive to this day. Looking at the clay which forms those tablets, scholars can reconstruct part of the Amurrite story. The study in question was led by Yuvan Goren, Israel Finkelstein, and Nadav Naaman, working out of Tel Aviv University. They and their research team examined 300 tablets from the Amarna Letters Archive and others. These tablets are on display in museums, and the letters came from many kingdoms across Canaan and Syria. In the course of this project, the scientists analyzed the petrography of the letters and their materials. Petrography, literally, is the study of rocks, but more generally, it involves examination of minerals at a microscopic level. The scholars took the clay tablets and studied them at the closest possible detail. Analyzing the compounds, material, and elements, scientists can identify the physical origins of an object. They can figure out where the letter maker and the letter writer were living when they made this message. Out of 300 letters involved in the study, 16 of them came from Amurru. They were written by the lords of this region and sent to various rulers. Apparently, 2 of the messages were composed in a mountainous area just east of Tripoli, that is a city on the Mediterranean coast. Another 4 were composed in Ardata, which is further east and south of Tripoli. 6 letters were composed in Erkata, a town further north and east. Finally, 3 letters were composed in Sumur, a harbour town on the coast, approximately 30 kilometers north of Tripoli. In other words, the Amurrite letters all come from a small region near the Mediterranean in modern-day Lebanon. Based on these results, the scholars could pinpoint the rough area of Amurrite activity, and when they compared that scientific data with the actual text of the letters, they could reconstruct some historical events. For one thing, there does seem to be a pattern in the movement of these letters. Chronologically, the earliest letters come from the mountainous areas just east of Tripoli. That seems to be one of the original strongholds for the Amurrite rulers. Slightly later, messages come from Ardata, just further east. Apparently, the Amurrites expanded into that region, taking control of it early in their campaign. Third, the warlords moved north into the area of Erkata. Erkata was a major center, one of the Egyptian bases in this region. Capturing Erkata, the Amurrites came dangerously close to starting a war with Egypt. But their letters, which they sent from this city, are full of excuses. Amurrite letters sent from Erkata say things like, "My lord, I am your servant, and your words are like sweet breath to me. I listen to everything you say. Do not believe anyone who is denouncing me. I am your true servant forever." Curiously, one of these letters might reveal the Lord of Amurru in a lie. Aziru, the criminal lord of this land, claims to have been in a region called Tunip and Nuhashi, but those are much further east than Erkata, and yet study of the clay tablet says that this message was manufactured and dispatched from Erkata. It is possible that Aziru had returned to Erkata following his time in the east, but it's also possible that he was not quite truthful about his location. Maybe he was trying to delay further response or messages from the pharaoh. It might be innocent, but then again, maybe not. It's interesting that this letter does not mention Erkata at all, but the clay for the tablet definitely came from that location. Anyway, the texts from these letters are famous among historians, and they have been studied for decades. But now we have a deeper understanding of the physical composition, and we can draw a greater connection between the language of these people and the objects they are actually using. It helps to paint a more lively and detailed picture. You can imagine the Amurrite leaders sending out their scribes to scoop up clay. They prepare the tablets and draft their words quickly, sending messages to reassure the Egyptians. Everything is fine, we're not attacking you, there is a logic to this. But in the process, the clay tablets themselves become a signature of the Amurrite movements and raids. This also raises an interesting possibility. The pharaoh and his courtiers were a long way from Amurru and the Mediterranean coast. They were relying on messages from their representatives to give them information about what was happening. In an age when transport was limited to horseback, ship, and foot messengers, there's a certain degree of ignorance bound up in all of these affairs. The pharaoh and his officials did not really know where a particular person was at any one time. The last report they had was the best information they could go on. By comparison, modern scientists can study the same text which the pharaohs received, but they can also examine the composition of the object itself to pinpoint things with greater precision and accuracy. In other words, there's a certain aspect where, nowadays, we know more about these letters than the pharaohs did themselves. Obviously, there's a lot of information that has vanished into history or was never written down, but it's an interesting feature that, thanks to modern science, we can understand the object more deeply than even the ancient recipient. So the letters from Erkata are an especially good example of how modern analysis can really flesh out the information contained in the text. Texts are always the most valuable source for historians. They give us insight into the words, deeds, and thoughts of the ancients. But now, with new technologies, we can go beyond those words. We can reveal movements, locations, maybe even lies. In effect, modern science allows us to view the footprints that had disappeared into the sand. Finally, the fourth set of letters reveal the Amurrites' biggest gamble. These messages come from Sumer. Sumer, on the Mediterranean coast, was another bastion of Egypt's imperial rule. The Amurrite leaders came to Sumer, and in a terribly bold move, they captured the city and killed its Egyptian governor. We are not sure how long the Amurrites stayed at Sumer. This part of the story is incredibly murky, but they were there long enough to compose 3 messages for the Egyptian court. Again, the lords of Amurru sent their messages to reassure the pharaoh. One of these messages, Amarna letter 165, tries to reassure the Egyptians that the Amurrite leader is a devoted servant. Very briefly, this message says things like, "To the pharaoh, my lord, my god, my son, message of Aziru, your servant. I fall at the feet of my lord 7 times and 7 times. I am guarding the land of the king, my lord, and I am devoted to the service of the king. May the king, my lord, heed my words. I am afraid of the king, and of Tutu, the Egyptian governor. Here are my gods and my messenger." End quote. Interestingly, that letter does not mention Sumer, but studying the clay tablet itself, the researchers know it came from this city. It sounds like the Amurrite leader was bargaining for time, trying to forestall any Egyptian response. Again, we're not sure how long the Amurrites stayed in Sumer. It could have been a short time, or it could have been a long time. We do know that other letters from later in their careers come from different cities, so it's possible they were moving around the region, managing their business, or maybe trying to avoid the Egyptians. Whatever happened exactly, this analysis is wonderful. Scientific study of the very clay itself can help reconstruct the phases of an ancient war. The study itself is more detailed than I can explain here. Fortunately, the researchers have made it available, free to the public. If you want to read Goren, Finkelstein, and Nahman's study, you can do so on the website academia.edu. There is a link in the episode description to their article. For those doing a web search, the title is "The Expansion of the Kingdom of Amurru According to the Petrographic Investigation of the Amarna Tablets." Whew, that's a classic academic title, but it does give the essentials. If you are interested in geology, ancient lives, or simply love a detective story, I highly recommend this article. Once again, there is a link in the episode description. The letters we just described mostly concern the leaders Abdi Ashiata and his son Aziru. They were the main instigators of Amurru's rise to power, and they are the ones who clashed most often with their neighbors. But inevitably, both of those men died. The father, and then the son, reached the end of their time on Earth, and new generations came to power. The descendants of Abdi Ashiata and Aziru had to deal with a radically different environment. The kingdom of Amurru had risen to great prominence, but it had taken much from its neighbors and the surrounding region. Now, as the 14th century drew to a close, the political landscape was changing, and soon all of their gains would bring a heavy price. At some point during Aziru's reign, the Lord of Amurru broke away officially from Egypt. At that point, the king of Amurru made a deal with the Hittites. The Hittite Empire, emerging out of Anatolia, was the rising power in Syria and Mesopotamia, and the Amurrites, apparently, felt that they were better off making friends with Hatti than they were with Egypt. To do that, King Aziru made a treaty with the Hittites, and that treaty actually survives today. I described that treaty and the events leading up to it in episode 142C, Aziru's Betrayal. But long story short, the Lord of Amurru made friends with the Hittites, and this treaty made Amurru and Hatti strong friends and allies. Following Aziru's death, his son ruled the kingdom of Amurru. Unfortunately, he also died after a short rule. And then power came to Aziru's grandson. This man's name was Tupi-Teshup. Tupi-Teshup was a weak ruler, to begin. When his father died, he was sickly or ill, and apparently Tupi-Teshup had to rely on Hittite support to gain his throne. We'll come back to that in a moment, but to set the scene, the lords of Amurru, starting with Aziru, had made friendship with Hatti. Now, Aziru's grandson depended on Hatti for his authority. The kingdom of Amurru was growing much closer to its imperial overlord. Early in his reign, Tupi-Teshup made a treaty with the Hittites. A clay tablet, covered in writing, preserves the agreement between this king and Mursili II, the great king of Hatti. The treaty itself was discovered in the archives of the Hittite capital city, Hattusha, and this text reveals Tupi-Teshup's relationship with the mighty Hittite Empire. The treaty is long, I won't read the whole thing, but it does have some interesting information, and it helps set the scene for Amurru around 1300 BCE. So, let's dive in. The treaty begins with context. It lays out the background and introduces the two rulers. It says, quote, "So speaks my majesty, Mursili, the great king of Hatti, the hero, beloved of the storm god, the son of Suppiluliuma, who also was great king of Hatti, to Tupi-Teshup. Aziru, your grandfather, became the subject of my father. Aziru protected my father, Suppiluliuma, and my father protected Aziru, together with his land. When Aziru became an old man and was no longer able to go on military campaigns, then his son, your father, went to war in his place, leading the chariots and infantry of the land of Amurru. But when your father died, Tupi-Teshup, I did not cast you out, because your father had spoken your name before me during his lifetime. Therefore, I took care of you, even though you were sick and ailing, and although you were incapable, I nonetheless placed you upon the throne of your father. I made your brothers and the entire land of Amurru swear an oath to you." End quote. The opening paragraphs set the scene, and they may sound formulaic, but there is something important going on here. It concerns the relationship and power dynamic between Hatti and Amurru. Tupi-Teshup's ancestors had made friends with Hatti, and the great lords like Aziru had worked alongside the Hittites. That relationship was one of respect and mutual cooperation. But now, Tupi-Teshup was in a different position. He had not come to power on his own merits. The king of Hatti had placed him on his throne. In short, the king of Amurru now depended on Hatti. His ancestors had been strong, but he was weak. The king of Amurru now relied on Hittite support. With that very important context established, the great king now confirms Tupi-Teshup's position. The treaty says, quote, "Now, as I took care of you, Tupi-Teshup, and installed you in the kingship of your father, I have now made you swear an oath. This oath is to the king of Hatti and the land of Hatti, and to my sons and my grandsons. Observe the oath and the authority of the king. My majesty will protect you, and when you take a wife and produce a son, he shall also be king in the land of Amurru. As you, Tupi-Teshup, protect my majesty, I will likewise protect your son." End quote. The lord of Amurru would swear an oath to serve and protect the great king of Hatti. The oath was binding and carried a blatant threat. As long as Tupi-Teshup maintained his loyalty, he and his family would rule for generations. But if he broke his loyalty, then Hatti would bring destruction upon Tupi-Teshup and his children. It's a classic offer he can't refuse. The king of Hatti has the power, Tupi-Teshup does not. And like any sensible king, Mursili imposes strict requirements. As long as they cooperate, they are friends. If not, well, Those are the necessary foundations of the treaty. They have established the context, why they are making this agreement, and they have established the terms on which the agreement is built, and the consequences that will occur if it is broken. Now, King Mursili, Lord of Hatti, finally turns to the details. Again, it's long, so I won't read the whole thing, but the noteworthy parts go like this. First, the Land of Amurru would pay tribute. Every year, they would deliver 300 shekels of refined gold, and this would be measured according to Hittite weights and balances. In other words, the Amurrites were obliged to gather a certain amount of gold every year. They would melt it down and fashion it into ingots, or some predetermined shape. They would then take that to Hittite administrators, and when the Hittite bureaucrats were satisfied with the weight, they would deliver that to the great king. Basically, it's a protection racket, an annual payment to ensure Hatti's friendship. The second part is quite interesting. Amurru would promise total loyalty to Hatti. That is fairly standard. But this loyalty went beyond friendship and military assistance. It extended all the way to diplomacy and communications. Specifically, the great king of Hatti sets out terms for Amurru's relationship with Egypt. In the text, the great king of Hatti says, quote, "While the king of Egypt is hostile to my majesty, if you secretly send your messenger to him, or if you become hostile to the king of Hatti, me, and cast off my authority to become a subject of the king of Egypt, you, Tupi-Teshub, will violate the oath." End quote. So, if Hatti was in conflict with Egypt, Amurru was forbidden to send any messages or embassies to that land. The treaty is quite specific here. It doesn't mention any other countries, just no deals with Egypt as long as we are enemies. I like that. It's direct and to the point. Make friends with other kingdoms if you wish, but Egypt is no-go. Stay away. No messaging your ex. Following that very strict instruction, the treaty turns to more generic things. Amurru and Hatti would assist one another in war. If either country was invaded by somebody else, then Hatti or Amurru should march to their friend's defense. Likewise, if the great king of Hatti invaded somebody else, then Tupi-Teshub or one of his family members should take Amurrite troops to support the Hittites. There's even a section about sabotage. Tupi-Teshub was forbidden from communicating or sending messages to anyone whom the king of Hatti was fighting. If Hatti wanted to invade a land, and Tupi-Teshub warned that land of an attack, that was a violation. Essentially, these terms give the Hittites military control over Amurru. The lord of Amurru, Tupi-Teshub, must obey his great king. He must send warriors to assist the Hittites, whether they are being attacked or attacking someone else. The Hittites even forbid Amurru from communicating with certain lands. To some degree, the terms are standard, but when you combine them with the foundations of the treaty, where Tupi-Teshub relies on the Hittites for his throne and authority, and you start to see the elements of control. Basically, Tupi-Teshub and his warriors were now the henchmen of the Hittite Empire. The rest of the treaty lays out terms of obedience and command. If the great king of Hatti issues orders, Tupi-Teshub must obey. It's interesting, but a bit too detailed, so I won't get into it here. Finally, the treaty closes with a religious clause. To confirm the oaths, Mursili invokes the gods of Hatti and the gods of Amurru. The gods of both lands would bear witness to the agreement. If Tupi-Teshub broke this treaty, then all of those gods, Hittite and Amurrite, would bring vengeance upon his house, his family, and his land. On the flip side, if Tupi-Teshub upheld the treaty and maintained his loyalty, then all of those gods would protect him and his family and his people. So, 50-50. Tupi-Teshub is safe as long as he obeys. If not, then calamity to all. This treaty is important for understanding Amurru and the Hittites in the late 1300s. Following Aziru's decision to join an alliance with Hatti, the subsequent generations came more and more under Hittite power. By the late 1300s, Amurru was closely tied with Hatti, and the Great Empire effectively controlled it. We're not sure exactly when Tupi-Teshub made this treaty, but from the Egyptian perspective, it probably happened sometime in the reign of Horemheb. By the time of King Sety, shortly after Horemheb, the Amurrites were well and truly part of the Hittite Empire. In theory, that would make it harder for the pharaohs to attack. Nevertheless, Sety began his assault. So, we have treaties between Amurru and Hatti. What's more, the lord of Amurru, Tupi-Teshub, seems to be a client of the Hittite kingdom. The lord owed his position and his rule to Hittite patronage. On that basis, we can say that Amurru was firmly part of the Hittite Empire. Then, along came Sety. Sety's battle reliefs at Karnak Temple reference an attack on Amurru. The image of that attack is currently hidden, but while we don't have the visual confirmation, we do have some texts. For one thing, the pharaoh's battle at Kadesh specifically references Amurru as part of the larger campaign. We know the Kadesh attack happened, and Sety almost certainly succeeded in his efforts. Logically, it would make sense for the pharaoh to follow up with an attack on Amurru. Amurru and Kadesh were relatively close. Kadesh was down in the riverlands along the Orontes. Amurru was in the highlands, the Mount Lebanon range. Nevertheless, the two were geographically close, and they had been politically close as well. In the reign of Akhenaten, 40 years before Sety, the lords of Amurru had made friends with the lords of Kadesh. The two cities and their armies had gone raiding together, attacking neighbors and burning towns. At one point, the pharaoh Akhenaten had written furiously to the lord of Amurru. He said things like, "I hear you are friendly with the ruler of Kadesh. Why? Why are you at peace with a ruler whom I, the pharaoh, am fighting?" I am paraphrasing that letter, but Akhenaten was not happy with Amurru's choice of friends. So having retaken Kadesh and defeated its rulers, Sety might logically decide to carry on. One rebel kingdom was down, why not tackle the other? Amurru was just up the road, and if Kadesh could fall this easily, maybe Amurru would as well. At this point, we have to assume that Sety's battle reliefs show him fighting Amurru. We don't have the details, but following the other scenes at Karnak, we can guess the general picture. Sety probably appeared in his chariot with horses charging forward. The king would loose arrows from his bow, filling the enemy with darts. The Amurrites, presumably, appeared as a chaotic mass. Infantry and chariots would tumble about, getting tangled amid one another. Then, on the other side of the scene, opposite Sety, there would have been a city. A fortified bastion atop a hill would have marked the center, quote-unquote, of Amurru's kingdom. Again, Sety's other scenes reveal the basic formula. The city would have high walls, and people would stand atop them, watching the pharaoh's assault. Naturally, they would beg for mercy as Sety conquered their army. Some of them might fall, pierced with arrows, and hieroglyphs on the city would have named Amurru as a destination. That is probably how Sety would have depicted this campaign. I won't describe any details because we don't have any, but if you have seen the other Sety reliefs, you can imagine this fight. Pharaoh triumphant, enemies humbled, Amurru defeated. Sety probably showed Amurru as a fortified town. That raises an interesting question. Amurru was a pastoral land in the mountains. Did it even have cities or fortresses? If Sety attacked a town of Amurru, could we locate that battle? Well, maybe. Ancient texts do reference a city, quote-unquote, called Amurru. They also reference a land called Amurru. The Egyptians also made this distinction. Sometimes they called the region Sety I, the land of Amurru. That was the name for the area as a whole, but the Egyptians also reference a place called Sety I, that is, the land of the Amurru. That may sound like a minor difference in English, but in Egyptian it's important. The reference to a land of Amurru and a land of the Amurru might mark the difference between a region and a city. In 1991, a scholar named Robert Stieglitz published a study of the City of Amurru as a concept. It was a short paper, but looking at references to cities versus regions, the author did find a pattern of use. Supposedly, some references do mark a distinction between a general area called Amurru and a specific location or town with the same name. On that basis, Stieglitz worked through the known sites of Bronze Age Canaan to find the most likely place for Amurru town. His conclusion? The city, quote-unquote, of Amurru was probably the coastal town that we call Sumer. We visited Sumer early in this episode. Back in their initial campaigns, the lords Abdi Ashirta and Aziru had come to that town, and there's evidence that they attacked or even captured it. Scientists have even identified clay tablets bearing letters dispatched from that city by these rulers. With that in mind, it is possible that the lords of Amurru renamed Sumer as the town of Amurru. Or at the very least, the Egyptians may have started to call it that. If Abdi Ashirta and Aziru took up residence in Sumer, perhaps this became the capital of their kingdom. That is speculative, but if Stieglitz is correct that the city of Amurru is the town of Sumer, that might give us a location for Seti's victory against these people. According to Stieglitz, there is a distinction between a land called Amurru and a town called Amurru, and this distinction appears in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Notably, King Sety I uses the same language when he describes his campaign. His battle scene for Kadesh refers to Pa-ta in Kedja, the land of Kadesh, and Pa-ta in Pa-amer, the land of the Amurru. Again, the difference is small, easy to miss, but it may give us our clue. Seti's battle against Amurru may have occurred near the Mediterranean coast, at the town we call Sumer. Perhaps the lords of Amurru were ruling from this city, or they fled there when they heard of Seti's invasion. Sumer would have been fortified, and since it was on the coast, it may have offered some hope of escape via ships. If that is accurate, we can start to imagine the battle more clearly. The Egyptian army, fresh from victory over Kadesh, now moved west. They entered the hills and valleys of Mount Lebanon, and passing through this region, they defeated or scattered the Amurrite forces. The lords of Amurru, faced with an overwhelming military force, may have fled westward, towards the coast and the stronghold at Sumer. That town, which the Egyptians had started calling the town of Amurru, may have been the site of the final battle, a battle in which Sety, allegedly, was triumphant. We can't see the battle image that Sety commissioned, it is hidden behind a wall, but based on other scenes, like the attack on Kadesh, and other studies of ancient armies, we can make a few guesses what the Amurrite warriors looked like. Like the Kadeshians or the Canaanites of the south, the Amurrites probably went into battle wearing kilts, maybe with a robe or a coat over the top. They would have had archers, who carried arrows on their back, and drew long bows. The elite warriors would have ridden in chariots. They would fire arrows from these chariots or charge with spears. The infantry would carry rectangular shields, and they might carry throwing sticks, spears, or even axes and swords. The wealthiest troops may have worn bronze helmets. For the poorer folks, they might wear a white headband or fillet to keep the hair out of their eyes, or perhaps a skull cap protecting their head against blows. Again, this is speculation based on other nearby cultures, but the battle against Amurru, if it actually happened, was probably an engagement between blocks of infantry and chariots. Archers would fire upon the foe to weaken them before the foot soldiers with spears and axes charged headlong. The chariots would swing around to the sides, loosing arrows into the dense infantry formations. Hopefully, the chariots would cause chaos in the enemy ranks and allow one side to rout or overawe the other. Casualties in the battle itself may have been relatively small, but as soon as one side turned and fled, that was the moment to start killing in earnest. Chariots would ride down any soldier who was fleeing. The archers would loose arrow after arrow into the backs of the running warriors. The idea, at its basic sense, was to cause your enemy to flee. Then, you could kill with impunity. Scenes like this probably appeared in Sety's battle reliefs, depicting his attack on Amurru. Hopefully, one day, scholars will access those images and see all the details which the artists carved on the walls. For now, perhaps our imagination can conjure up the great battle between blocks of infantry and racing hordes of chariots before the walls of Amurru, or Sumer. The great king of Egypt and his army may have surged against their northern foes. The next logical question is, who was victorious? Sety might show the battle at Karnak Temple, but did he actually win? That's not a rhetorical question. We may have an answer. Around 1300 BCE, the pharaoh Sety I claims to have invaded and conquered Amurru. As always, we should be skeptical of that claim. The pharaoh could easily commission art showing a great victory, but that didn't mean he achieved it. Do we have any proof that Sety actually defeated Amurru? The answer comes from an unexpected source. Earlier in the episode, we explored the treaties between Amurru and the Hittites. About 30 to 40 years after Sety I, another king of Hatti made another deal with Amurru. Around 1260 BCE, approximately, a great king of Hatti named Hattusili made a new treaty with the Amurrite rulers. That treaty came about after some incredibly dramatic events. Great upheavals and battles had transpired in Syria, Kadesh, and Amurru. According to this later treaty, the Amurrites had participated in those battles, and more importantly, they had fought against the Hittites. In the opening section of this treaty, the great king of Hatti describes those events, and according to this section, the kingdom of Amurru had temporarily broken away from the Hittite Empire. The text is long, so I'll just paraphrase it with a few snippets. But essentially, the king of Hatti described events as follows. First, Aziru had made a treaty with Hatti. Then, Aziru's son and his grandson, Tupi-Teshub, had maintained their loyalty. Following that, though, things went bad. The men of Amurru, quote-unquote, turned traitor. Apparently, they committed an offense against the king of Hatti, and they sent a message saying, "We were voluntary subjects, but now we are no longer your subjects." And they went over to the king of Egypt. As a result, the Hittites and the Egyptians had fought a war in this region. That Hittite-Egyptian war is a tale for the future, but you get the point. At some time after Tupi-Teshub and his treaty with Hatti, the Amurrites had betrayed their allegiance. They had gone back to the Egyptian Empire, making friends with and serving the pharaoh. That is quite an about-face, and it begs the question, what might have inspired the Amurrites to turn traitor? The simplest explanation is that Sety I forced them to do so. If his battle reliefs at Karnak are accurate, the king of Egypt may have invaded Amurru. Following his victory at Kadesh, the pharaoh swept through the region, and he may have battled, even destroyed, Amurrite forces. The campaign itself is largely unknown. We are piecing it together from clues and references. But looking at the big picture, things are starting to fall into place. In the late 1300s BCE, the lord of Amurru, Tupi-Teshub, was still a vassal of Hatti. Around 1300 BCE, the king of Egypt, Sety I, invaded Canaan and Syria. Subsequently, a later king of the Hittites referenced a period in which Amurru and Egypt had become friendly once more. Putting 2 and 2 together, along with some other historical details, we may have some solid foundations. It seems increasingly likely that King Sety I and his army did invade Amurru, and they may have been victorious over that kingdom. Presumably, Sety compelled the Amurrite leaders to swear loyalty to him. They broke their treaties with the Hittites and rejoined the Egyptian Empire. This picture comes from various fragmentary sources, but thanks to recent scholarship, we are starting to see things more clearly. It's quite likely that Sety I did reconquer Amurru. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. I hope you have enjoyed this little side chapter. I have to say, I really like telling the story of Amurru. It's such an intriguing kingdom, and their history is both complicated and endlessly fascinating. On the one hand, we know almost nothing about its culture, its beliefs, and its borders. On the other hand, we know an awful lot about its leaders and their deeds. They are a fascinating group, and I love visiting them every now and again. As I mentioned earlier, there is additional, older content attached to the end of this. We have now reached the end of the new content, but if you're interested in the backstory and rise of Amurru and its leaders like Abdi Ashirta and Aziru, stick around just after this. For those who are disembarking now, thank you for listening. We'll be back very soon with episode 183. In which King Sety I, fresh from his victories over Kadesh and Amurru, must face off directly with the Hittites. The pharaoh's invasion demands an answer. The king of Hatti is going to come in force. That is releasing very soon. Take care, and may the 1,000 gods of Hatti, the storm god of Amurru, and the great lords of the Nile Valley bless your house and all your endeavors. I hope your friendships are solid and reliable. Inshallah, your alliances will last for centuries. And now, for those who are interested, here is a compilation of the stories of Amurru. Originally, these released as episodes 123, 124, and 142C. I realize not everyone has the time to go back and hunt out for individual episodes, so, for those who want them, here is a compilation of the story. The tale begins in the early 1300s BCE. The king of Egypt was Amunhotep III, or Akhenaten. It was a time of great prosperity and imperial splendor for Egypt, but on the borders of their empire, things were about to change. Our story today takes us far from Egypt, far from the tranquil waters of the Nile Valley. We are headed for the land to the north, to the distant frontiers of Pharaoh's empire. To reach our destination, we must sail out of the Nile Delta and travel along the Mediterranean coast, heading east and then north. We pass the Sinai Peninsula with its cold, wet winds and its endless dunes ready to swallow the unwary. We sail along the southern coast of Canaan, past Egyptian bases like Gaza and Joppa, where officials stockpiled food and weapons. Then we move further north, past other cities that exist to this day, Tyre and Sidon, Beirut and Byblos, until we reach a land that nowadays is part of the country Lebanon. This is our destination. Disembarking our ship, we are confronted with a rugged land. The coastline is a narrow strip, and mountain ranges tower in the east. The peaks are formidable, up to 3,000 meters tall. In the winter, snow blankets the heights. Below, the foothills are thickly forested. Depending on the season, the climate is either a dry summer or a shivering, rainy winter. In this part of the world, ancient people worked hard to build a way of life out of challenging surroundings. If we travelled inland from the coast, finding our way through the mountains, we would eventually reach a country called Amurru. Amurru, or Amir in Egyptian, was a small backwater area. It was lined with mountains, with deep river valleys in between. Thick forests covered the slopes, and snow sometimes capped the peaks. In the more hospitable regions, shepherds and herders made their homes among foothills, and farmers grew crops in the more fertile parts of the country. The kingdom, quote-unquote, was isolated from the sea. It lacked major ports or any access to the coast. And in the world of the Bronze Age, this made Amurru a small, unimportant area in the middle of great empires. Of course, the leaders of Amurru wanted to change that, and around this time they started to pursue greater status. This is where our story begins, with a lord of Amurru named Abdi Asherta. Abdi Asherta, or servant of Asherta, was the ruler of this small, out-of-the-way country. He was a vassal of Egypt, giving his tribute and loyalty to the pharaoh. Apparently, Abdi obtained his throne thanks to the king of Egypt. A text from this time indicates that the pharaoh had, quote, placed Abdi Asherta over the Amurrites, end quote. So, Abdi Asherta was Egypt's loyal vassal, a man put in power thanks to the grace of Pharaoh. When our story begins around 1365 BCE, Abdi Asherta was already in power. We're not sure how long, but what we do know is that his reign was going to prove notable in many ways. Having taken charge of Amurru and its people, Abdi Asherta soon began to transform this land into a noteworthy regional powerhouse. To understand how Abdi Asherta did this, we need a quick geopolitical recap. For the last 100 years, the rulers of Amurru had given their loyalty and tribute to the pharaoh of Egypt. The country was part of the Egyptian Empire, which stretched from the Sinai Peninsula up through Canaan and into southern Syria. It was a land of many ethnicities, peoples, and territories, each with their own rulers and all giving loyalty to the pharaoh. A few generations earlier, warrior kings like Thutmose III and Amunhotep II had swept through this part of the world. Soldiers marched out of Egypt to capture towns, intimidate leaders, and destroy any who resisted. Following this wave of conquests, the Egyptian monarchs had taken care to fortify their new holdings. They established small power bases at major cities throughout the area, and they put officials, representatives, in charge of the various strongholds. Now, the pharaoh's commissioners held sway over the region, keeping an eye on the locals and ensuring that the peoples of Canaan and Syria gave their loyalty and their tribute to the pharaoh, lord of battles, ruler of all. Of course, the situation was a lot more complicated than that. Local rulers were not always obedient to the king's wishes, and they squabbled among themselves endlessly. Arguments were common, and the vassals were always watching their neighbours, anxious in case anyone got too powerful or the pharaoh favoured anyone too closely. This was the situation in which Abdi Asherta, lord of Amurru, came to prominence. When he first gained power, Abdi Asherta's land was in a precarious position. Not only was it poor, with no access to the Mediterranean trade routes, but it nestled between other, far more powerful kingdoms. Amurru sat between three great powers, Egypt in the south, Mitanni in the east, and to the north, a growing power called the Hittites. During his lifetime, Abdi Asherta would mainly be concerned with Egypt and Mitanni, but when it comes to the Hittites, well, let's just say keep that name in mind. For the first few years, Abdi Ashirta was a loyal vassal to the pharaoh. He sent letters to the king of Egypt, proclaiming his loyalty and dispatching gifts. In these early days, probably during the last years of Amunhotep III, Abdi Ashirta was the very image of a loyal subject. He wrote messages like the following, quote, "To the king, the sun, my lord, message of Abdi Ashirta, your servant, the dirt under your feet. I fall at the feet of my king, my lord, 7 times and 7 times. As I am a servant for the king and a mere dog of his house, I guard Amurru for the king, my lord." End quote. The ruler of Amurru called himself a servant of the king and a dog of his house, and even the mud under your feet. Phrases like these show up a lot in the Amarna letters, suggesting that hierarchy and subservience were important attitudes for Pharaoh's vassals. In this day and age, status and prestige were vital parts of any royal relationship. For men like Abdi Ashirta, it was essential to give the pharaoh his glory. Other letters fill out the shadowy period when Abdi Ashirta was still a loyal subject to the king. On one occasion, the lord of Amurru dispatched, quote, 10 beautiful women to Egypt. He sent this at the king's request, and in return, Abdi Ashirta asked his overlord to, quote, "send an official to protect me." Now, it's not exactly clear which pharaoh asked for these women, but again, it was probably Amunhotep III, who is well known for asking his foreign friends to send him beautiful ladies. The gift of women was a noteworthy, but for us, slightly dubious offering. While we talk about these events with the comforting distance of history, it's always vital to remember that these were very real, very powerful experiences for the people witnessing them. Those women that Abdi Ashirta sent had to endure forced relocation from their homeland, possibly more than once, and their lives were not theirs to control. Likewise, the many communities that bore witness to the conflicts of this period undoubtedly suffered greatly. People lost their lives, blood was spilled, and a great deal of pain was inflicted on innocent bystanders. Abdi's gift are a stern reminder of the cost, in lives, that the Egyptian empire, all empires really, involved. For a few years, Abdi Ashirta was loyal, but eventually things began to change. We're not sure why. Maybe the threat of foreign powers encouraged him to seek security outside of Egypt's empire. Maybe he wanted wealth and glory, or maybe he was threatened. Whatever the cause, Abdi soon began to push beyond his borders and started expanding his kingdom. He was surprisingly successful. Sometime around 1365 BCE, give or take, Abdi Ashirta went rogue. The lord of Amurru started to expand his dominion, sending warriors out to intimidate local communities and force them to join him. We hear about this from Abdi's neighbours. As the lord of Amurru started his campaigns, the other lords around this country reported on the events. These letters are difficult to untangle. Very few of them have dates, so the chronology is impossible to know for certain. But as far as scholars can reconstruct, Abdi Ashirta seems to have acted as follows. First up, Abdi gathered warriors from the outlaws, brigands, and landless peasantry of his land. Then he began to send these warriors out to raid the surrounding countryside. His troops intimidated local leaders, ransacked communities, and waylaid travelers on the road. From the forests and mountains of central Lebanon, these brigands caused havoc in the countryside. Eventually, they started to attack prosperous towns and pressure their leaders into joining Abdi Ashirta's kingdom. The reports are alarming. Apparently, Abdi Ashirta was capturing cities quickly and encouraging rebellion among local peasants. Before too long, some of the major coastal towns were cut off from one another, and the land of Amurru started to form into a cohesive state. In one daring escapade, Abdi Ashirta even attacked the city of Sumer. This was a town near the Mediterranean coast and one of the main strongholds of Egypt's northern empire. Sumer was a power base. It had an Egyptian governor living in its palace, and his name was Pahamnate. The city itself was part of the bustling Mediterranean trade network. This made it a tempting target, and when the Egyptian governor left Sumer on business, Abdi Ashirta seized his opportunity. At some point, maybe in the last years of Amunhotep III, Abdi Ashirta's men entered the city of Sumer and occupied it. They did not do this openly. Abdi wasn't stupid enough to launch an attack in broad daylight. Instead, the Lord of Amurru claimed that he was occupying Sumer in order to protect it from local threats. In a remarkable letter, Abdi tells the Egyptian governor Pahamnate that the foreigners were menacing the city. He claims that Sumer was undefended, that its leading citizens had fled, and that, on account of this, the city was vulnerable to attack. Thus, Abdi Ashirta occupied Sumer, and he justified it as follows, quote, "To Pahamnate, my lord, message of Abdi Ashirta, your servant. I fall at the feet of my lord, but I ask you, what do the words that you speak mean? You say to me, quote, 'You, Abdi Ashirta, are an enemy of Egypt, and you have committed a crime against Egyptians.' End quote. But may my lord listen. There were no men in Sumer to guard the city as you had ordered, and Sumer was afraid of the troops of Shekhlal. So I myself hastened to Sumer, and I rescued it from the troops of Shekhlal. If I had not been staying nearby, if I had been staying where life is peaceful, then the troops of Shekhlal would surely have sent Sumer and its palace up in flames. When I myself hastened to the rescue and arrived in Sumer, there were only 4 men that had stayed on in the palace, and they said to me, quote, 'Save us from the troops of Shekhlal.' And so I saved them. I did not expel them. My lord, the other mayors lie to you, and yet you keep on listening to them." End quote. There's a lot to unpack there, so let's break it down. Basically, Abdi Ashirta occupied the city of Sumer on a pretext. He claimed that a foreigner, Shekhlal, was threatening the city, and that Sumer was all but defenseless. So, Abdi Ashirta advanced in order to defend the town from the enemy troops. Abdi Ashirta came to the palace of Sumer and found that most of the local leaders had fled. Those who remained begged him to protect the city, and so Abdi Ashirta took control of Sumer. The incident apparently prompted an outraged response from Pahamnate, the Egyptian governor. He accused Abdi Ashirta of treachery, of being an enemy of Egypt. But Abdi rejected this and proclaimed loudly that his actions were done in service of Egypt. In Abdi's version of events, he was a loyal subject, the savior of a city that had been defenseless. We're not sure how the pharaoh received the news of these events, but Abdi's excuses seem to have worked, at least temporarily. He took control of Sumer and began administering it, claiming to do so in his overlord's name. Abdi's neighbours and the governor Pahamnate cried foul, but Pharaoh did not punish his vassal directly. So Abdi Ashirta's gamble paid off. He now ruled a noteworthy town, and his kingdom had access to the Mediterranean Sea. It was, in all respects, a most satisfying victory. As Abdi Ashirta made his early moves and expanded the kingdom of Amurru, reports began to fly back to Egypt, telling the king what was happening. These reports primarily come from Amurru's neighbours, and none were more concerned than the ruler of Byblos. Byblos, or Gubla in the ancient tongue, was a major city on the coast of Lebanon. It was incredibly ancient, and the people of Byblos had been trading with Egyptians for more than 1,000 years. Byblos, or Gubla, was a valuable part of the Egyptian empire, and its ruler knew that very well. Byblos was ruled by a mayor, a man named Rib-Adi. Rib-Adi is a famous name when it comes to Bronze Age diplomacy. He is one of the most prominent figures to show up in the Amarna letters, for he sent dozens of messages to the pharaoh during his time in office. Rib-Adi was so prolific that out of 380 surviving letters, more than 60 come from his frantic pen. This has given Rib-Adi a bit of a reputation as a complainer, a whiner, even a political hypochondriac, which is a little bit unfair, and we will analyse those accusations in the next episode. Suffice to say, the mayor of Byblos had good reason to be worried, and although he wrote many, many letters, his concerns were, at least partially, justified. As the Lord of Amurru marched into the town of Sumer, Rib-Adi was watching. The mayor of Byblos could see, as well as anyone, that Abdi-Ashirta now posed a threat. Problem was, the mayor was having trouble convincing others to respond or even acknowledge the danger. In a letter to the local Egyptian governor, Rib-Adi begged for military assistance, for the power of Pharaoh to help him in dark times. He said, quote, "To Haya the vizier, message of Rib-Adi, I fall at your feet. May Amun, the god of the king, your lord, establish your honor in the presence of the king. You, Haya, are a wise man. The king knows this, and because of your wisdom he sent you as a commissioner. But why have you been negligent, not speaking to the king so that he will send archers to retake Sumer? What is Abdi-Ashirta, a servant and a dog, that he takes the land of the king for himself? Through the Apiru, his army is strong." End quote. Rib-Adi, the mayor of Byblos, could see the danger. The Lord of Amurru was expanding westward, occupying towns along the Lebanese coast. If he continued on this path, then eventually Abdi and his warriors, called the Apiru, would surround more of the local towns. The army would grow, and the problem would eventually become too great to contain. Rib-Adi apparently could see this, and he begged one of the Egyptian commissioners, a man named Haya, to send him some reinforcements. In the last part of his letter, he said, quote, "Send me 50 pairs of horses and 200 warriors, so that I may resist the enemy in the city of Shigata until the coming forth of Pharaoh's archers. Do not let Abdi gather together all of the Apiru so that he can take the town of Shigata. If he does, there will be no place where men can enter against him." End quote. Abdi-Ashirta and his warriors were gaining strength. His army, made up of groups called the Apiru, were marshalling, and their numbers were growing. Surely Pharaoh could see that this was a great threat. Surely Rib-Adi could count on Egypt's support in the struggle that was inevitably to come. The Lord of Amurru was now in a very strong position. He had forged a new kingdom in the heart of Egypt's empire. As you can imagine, this kind of success was just the beginning. Soon, Abdi-Ashirta would start to expand once more. Coming up in Chapter 2, the battle heats up. Abdi-Ashirta turns his attention to Byblos and the towns which Rib-Adi governed. The struggle gets fierce, and Rib-Adi begs to know, why was Pharaoh not helping him? Also, we investigate the question, who were Abdi-Ashirta's warriors? This group, called the Apiru, where did they come from? And are they connected at all to the early Hebrews? All that and more after the break. See you in a moment. The year was approximately 1365 BCE. We're not sure when exactly, but these events probably took place in the last few years when Amunhotep III was king of Egypt. Eventually, they would cross over to the reign of Akhenaten, but the exact chronology is unknown. What we do know is that in the area of Lebanon, troubles were plaguing the Egyptian empire. The Lord of Amurru, a man named Abdi-Ashirta, was growing powerful. He had gathered an army of followers and begun raiding his neighbors. Pretty soon, he even captured a major Egyptian bastion, the town of Sumer. which put him in direct conflict with the representatives of Pharaoh. Now, Abdi Ashirta was expanding once again. Soon after his victory at Sumer, one of Abdi's neighbors wrote to the pharaoh. The mayor of Byblos, a man named Reb-Adi, was concerned, and with good reason. Although Sumer had fallen, still the warriors of Pharaoh remained at home, unresponsive to the problem. What was the king waiting for? Abdi Ashirta's march continued, and soon his warriors, the Apiru, were battering at the gates of towns in Reb-Adi's dominion. The mayor of Byblos technically governed at least 3 or 4 communities in the area. Now, Abdi Ashirta and the warriors of Amurru were moving against Byblos directly. Reb-Adi reported this to his king, dutifully but with alarm. He said, quote, Reb-Adi says to the king of all countries, the great king, the king of battle, may the lady of Byblos, Hathor, grant power to the king, my lord. I fall at the feet of my lord, my son, 7 times and 7 times. May the king know that the war against me is severe. Abdi Ashirta wants to take for himself the 2 cities that have remained loyal to me. Moreover, Abdi Ashirta, that dog, strives to take the land of the king for himself. He has gathered together all the Apiru against Shigata and Ampi, and he has taken those 2 cities. I now say, there is no place where man can enter against him. End quote. The war between Reb-Adi, mayor of Byblos, and Abdi Ashirta, lord of Amurru, was heating up. Defending the cities of Shigata and Ampi, both of which are on the map, Reb-Adi's warriors sought to stem the enemy's advance. They failed, and the 2 cities, or their leaders, surrendered to Abdi's men. All of a sudden, the lord of Amurru had gained 2 more towns on the Lebanese coast, and Reb-Adi of Byblos was starting to lose his grip on power. At this point, Reb-Adi started to beg the pharaoh for assistance. In the second part of this letter, the mayor said, quote, Please send me a garrison of 400 men and teams of horses with all speed. For years archers would come out to inspect the countryside, and yet now that the land of the king and Sumer, your bastion, have joined to the Apiru and Abdi Ashirta, you have done nothing. Send a large force of archers so that it may drive out the king's enemies, and all lands can be joined to the king once more. You are a great lord. You must not neglect this message. End quote. Reb-Adi begged the pharaoh for reinforcements to bolster his defences and resist the machinations of the enemy. The mayor was confused about the king's silence. Why wasn't the pharaoh reacting? Did he not care that his empire was being damaged by one wayward ruler? Surely it would be a simple matter to crush Abdi Ashirta, if only the pharaoh would send an army of reasonable size. And yet nothing was being done. 2 cities of Lebanon fell, and soon Reb-Adi was getting desperate. Having failed to defend Shigata and Ampi, the mayor of Byblos now retreated to a city called Batruna. At this point, he seems to have had just 2 major communities left in his small kingdom, Batruna itself and the home city of Byblos. With this foreign threat breathing down his neck, Reb-Adi dispatched yet another message to his king. He said, quote, Reb-Adi says to his lord, the king of all countries, the great king, etc., etc., etc. May the king, my lord, know that the war of Abdi Ashirta against me is severe. He has taken all of my cities. Now only 2 towns remain to me, and even these he strives to take. Like a bird in a trap, so am I trapped in Byblos. May my lord heed the words of his servant. I have just been in Batruna. Please send a garrison, 30 pairs of horses, in the charge of your commissioner. End quote. This message is broken towards the end, so we don't know the full details of what Reb-Adi asked from his king. What is clear is that the mayor of Byblos and the ruler of Batruna was losing ground rapidly. As the enemy warriors, Abdi Ashirta and his Apiru, advanced, Reb-Adi was losing his grip on territory. Once again, he wrote to Pharaoh asking for help, and once again, the reply seems to have been silence. Why was the king of Egypt, either Amunhotep III or Akhenaten, not responding promptly to this situation? It seems that a vassal had gone rogue and was expanding his kingdom at a critical border zone. Surely this was grounds for concern. Well, the answer is tricky. To make his country into something more than a regional backwater, the Lord of Amurru had to overcome at least 3 challenges. The first challenge he would face was opportunity. Amurru was surrounded pretty much on all sides by the cities and vassals of the pharaoh, so expansion was going to be difficult. Whatever direction he moved in, Abdi would be going against Egypt's interests. That could pose a problem. So the second challenge was diplomacy. Abdi Ashirta needed to expand his kingdom in a way that did not seem like a rebellion or an attack on the pharaoh's vassals. Both problems, opportunity for conquest and the need to maintain good relations with Egypt, were serious issues. How would the Lord of Amurru solve them? Abdi Ashirta's situation required an unusual solution, and he found one in the form of an ally. Not long before these events began, Abdi Ashirta had the great idea to make friends with a group of locals, a mysterious band who might provide the help he needed. These locals are called the Apiru, and they are a most interesting bunch indeed. Early in his reign, Abdi Ashirta gathered followers or allies from the group known as the Apiru. This is a curious group. Apiru, or Habiru, translates roughly as fugitive or refugee, and it could apply to a variety of people in different situations. During the Late Bronze Age, when our story takes place, the term Apiru had a derogatory sense. Depending on context, Apiru could mean outlaw, vagabond, or even public enemy. A recent equivalent might be the European prejudices against the Romani, or Gypsies, and the misconceptions that circulate about them. So yeah, Apiru seem to be the outcasts of Late Bronze Age Canaan, the people or peoples whom others looked down upon and viewed with hostility. According to the letters which Rebadi and others sent to the pharaoh, Abdi Ashirta employed Apiru as his warriors. We can't be sure if these were a single community or tribe, or small bands of ruffians, or even just little groups here and there. Either way, Abdi's neighbors accused him of allying with the outlaws to wage war in Lebanon. Presumably, the Lord of Amurru offered them plunder and wealth if they served his needs. Doing that, Abdi was able to quickly forge a fighting force, one that technically wasn't part of his kingdom. Looking at this situation strategically, with a little bit of modern sensibility, I'm starting to wonder if Abdi used the Apiru as a sort of false flag operation, a strategy designed to conceal responsibility and deceive the Egyptian government. The Apiru were men of no country, they didn't belong to anyone, so Abdi Ashirta had plausible deniability regarding their deeds. The outlaws could sweep into a community, raise havoc, and then Abdi Ashirta could show up to save the day and protect the town. Such a deception would enable Abdi to attack where he pleased, while officially still acting in Pharaoh's interests. I'm not usually one for conspiracy theories, but this one does explain a couple of nagging problems. For example, we must wonder how Abdi Ashirta got away with all of these attacks for as long as he did. Well, maybe this is why. Perhaps Abdi's deception worked and kept the true situation obscure, so that the king of Egypt couldn't quite be sure of the truth. With that kind of uncertainty, Abdi Ashirta's deception bought him time, and with enough time he could secure his own position. So maybe Abdi Ashirta employed the Apiru as a way of hedging his bets. He gathered the brigands, the outcasts of Canaanite society, and offered them a way to gain wealth. All they had to do was raid, plunder, and steal from his neighbors, and while they did that, Abdi could publicly deny any involvement. With a little bit of cunning, perhaps the allies could steal their way to political prominence. Now, let me digress briefly to discuss the elephant in the room, It's a big one, so indulge me for a moment. It has to do with the Bible. Given the name of this group, Apiru or Habiru, depending on the translation, it's probably not surprising that many scholars wonder if these were the early Hebrews. The names seem to parallel nicely, and the word Apiru might connect with the Hebrew word Ibrim, which means, well, Hebrews. Then you have the political context, stories of turmoil in Canaan, of roving warbands and political disruption. And these might have been some of the inspiration for narratives in the early Hebrew Bible. Chronologically, these stories might fit with traditions of the Exodus, which is a big subject in itself. As you can imagine, this kind of question is sensitive for many reasons. Once again, the term Apiru means fugitive or refugee. Broadly speaking, the term seems to apply to a social class rather than a single community, ethnicity, or culture. So the word was probably used to describe a broad category of people, the type of individuals who didn't fit within the worldview of other communities. In short, the Apiru were the quintessential outsiders, and that could mean different things depending on the person using the word. None of this negates the possibility that the Apiru are precursors to the biblical Hebrews, but it does mean that we have to be cautious about marrying late Bronze Age texts with a book that was composed, edited, and refined many centuries later. Perhaps a group of Apiru, a particular tribe or confederation, eventually became the young Hebrew or Israelite community. Perhaps the Hebrews took inspiration from the term, transforming a derogatory word into a badge of honor, or a way to differentiate themselves from others. This second interpretation is something which Jan Assmann, a German Egyptologist and long-running scholar of this material, argues quite elegantly. In his 2018 book, The Invention of Religion, Faith and Covenant in the Book of Exodus, Assmann suggests, quote, "It is entirely possible that a group of Canaanites who rejected the Egyptian occupying force and its vassals may have cultivated an alternative lifestyle, that they self-consciously positioned themselves outside the city-states and in opposition to them, and that they consequently appropriated a term of abuse, Apiru, for themselves. The term Apiru, wanderers, vagrants, bandits, or outlaws, is apt for a group that based its shared identity not just on biological kinship, but also, and especially, on common, alternative social practices." End quote. Basically, Assmann is suggesting that the Apiru may be a group or groups who rejected the normal bourgeois city living and went nomad. They lived outside the normal way of life and rejected its ways. And perhaps, over time, these practices transformed into a community spirit, a sense of self, one that eventually forged a new cultural identity. Maybe, just maybe, these Apiru are the first chapter in the biblical Hebrew story. I'm not a biblical historian, I'm not a linguist, so this kind of debate about a particular word and its meaning in the context of Near Eastern cultures is outside my expertise. The idea seems to have some merit, and I certainly would not be surprised if it were true, at least partially. To be fair, it's easy to imagine a way that an outcast group, loosely defined, might eventually have formed a new community. But it could also be a coincidence, a quirk of language history that doesn't mean what it seems to mean. On the current available evidence, we should be cautious. All we can say for sure is that the Apiru were a broad category of people whom the city dwellers considered outcasts and fugitives. Beyond that, we are still in the dark. Now, we've discussed the Apiru and a possible reason why Abdi Ashirta was able to expand his kingdom without reprisal for some time. There is another explanation though, and it's a little bit more suspicious. Back in chapter 1 of this episode, we learned how Abdi Ashirta, Lord of Amurru, actually gained his position from the pharaoh. The king of Egypt had made Abdi lord of his country, and now that he was expanding his territory, is it possible that he was doing so with Pharaoh's consent? Maybe, just maybe, Abdi was doing something that the king of Egypt considered useful. Abdi Ashirta was scrupulous when it came to promising that he was a loyal subject of Pharaoh. His letters, sent to the king and to the Egyptian governors, practically drip with sycophantic language. The Lord of Amurru always refers to himself as a loyal servant, or Arad Kiti in the local language. He calls himself a dog, the mud beneath Pharaoh's feet. He protests endlessly that he is an attentive vassal who guards the king's frontiers and protects his communities. Now, this second interpretation has a little bit of a conspiracy theory flavour to it, but let's consider the big picture. The country of Amurru was on the edge of the Egyptian Empire in Canaan. To the north and east, great powers like the Mitanni were still a potential threat. Even if the Mitanni and Egypt were friendly at the moment, maybe it wouldn't hurt to have a strong military power bolstering Egypt's frontier. This second interpretation may sound a little bit far-fetched, but it actually has a tiny shred of evidence to corroborate it. Abdi Ashirta, Lord of Amurru, was now sitting pretty. When he first came to power, his country was humble, a land of mountains, river valleys, and forests, with shepherds and farmers as his best resource. Now, he had expanded his territory, reaching all the way to the Mediterranean coast. He ruled at least one major town, the Egyptian bastion of Sumer, and he had gained possession of several more. His neighbors were panicking, and the pharaoh seemed disinterested. With luck, Abdi Ashirta had the makings of a real, lasting kingdom. Naturally, all of this local instability was going to attract some attention, but not from the pharaoh. Instead, Abdi Ashirta's first test came from Mitanni. East of Lebanon, in what is now Syria and Iraq, the kingdom of Mitanni was nearly 200 years old. Once it had been a supreme power, dominating much of the region. By now, though, it was fading a little bit. Still, Mitanni wasn't out of the fight. They had teeth, and Abdi Ashirta would learn that quite suddenly in the middle of his ascent. Sometime during all of these events, we're not exactly sure when, Abdi's attempt to make Amurru a regional power was rudely interrupted. Based on a few letters from the Amarna corpus, it seems that just as Amurru was rising, the king of Mitanni decided to visit or invade the region. One letter says, quote, "Furthermore, the king of Mitanni has come out as far as Sumer, and though he wanted to march as far as Byblos, he returned to his own land, for there was no water for him to drink." End quote. A second message adds further detail, and we hear how the king of Mitanni, or Matana in the local language, plundered the country of Amurru itself. In this second letter, Pharaoh was told, quote, "Day and night Amurru has cried out to you. They say that what is taken from them to Matana is very much." End quote. Both of these letters came from Rebadi, and maybe we should be suspicious about the accuracy of his report. After all, the mayor of Byblos was well known for crying wolf, sounding the alarm at every opportunity. Perhaps Rebadi was exaggerating events for the sake of getting Pharaoh's attention. Well, I don't think so. You see, at the same time that Rebadi was sending his messages, another of Pharaoh's vassals sent a letter reporting on the same situation. This chap said, quote, "Speak to the great king, my lord. Message of Tehu Teshub, your servant. I fall at the feet of my lord. Be informed that the king of Mitanni came forth, together with chariots and together with an expeditionary troop. We have heard nothing at all, and we are afraid of him." End quote. The situation seems reasonably clear. In the midst of the political chaos, with Abdi Ashirta marching around Lebanon, the king of Mitanni attacked suddenly out of the east. He came forth with troops and chariots, advancing rapidly into the country of Amurru and plundering the land. Now, why he did this is unclear. It's possible that the Mitanni king was responding to the situation, taking advantage of Abdi Ashirta's distraction. As the lord of Amurru was expanding his kingdom, maybe the king of Mitanni saw an opportunity for a quick victory. Or maybe the Mitanni ruler actually hoped to capture Abdi Ashurta and encourage him to switch sides, giving his loyalty to Mitanni rather than Egypt. This second motivation, I suspect, is the more likely. The Mitanni king advanced, but he did not stay for long. After a while, the invaders withdrew, but as they left, the foreign king took a valuable prisoner with him. Somewhere in this invasion, the king of Mitanni was able to apprehend or capture Abdi Ashurta, and when he departed, he took the lord of Amurru with him. A letter tells us, quote, "That dog, Abdi Ashurta, is in Mitanni, but his eye remains on Byblos. Moreover, all of the city lords, the mayors, are now at peace with Abdi Ashurta." End quote. Basically, the king of Mitanni swept into Amurru, despoiled the land, and captured Abdi Ashurta. The situation was quite fraught. Abdi was not independent so much as dependent on the goodwill and tolerance of far more powerful rulers. His story so far may sound like an unbroken string of successes, but they are a small, unbroken string of successes. Even at his most powerful, Abdi Ashurta was still the ruler of a minor kingdom, one in the midst of great powers. The king of Mitanni eventually left Lebanon, and he apparently released Abdi Ashurta, perhaps in exchange for a pledge of loyalty. We don't hear that much about this, only that the Mitanni ruler left, and Abdi, once again, resumed his aggression in the region. Well, he did that after a while. First, Abdi Ashurta had to contend with a very real, very human problem. He got sick. For a little while after the Mitanni invasion, Abdi Ashurta was quiet. He stayed in Amurru, maybe taking care of internal issues, and at one point we even know that he fell ill. Rabadi, the mayor of Byblos and correspondent of these events, wrote to the pharaoh of Egypt and notified him, quote, "The king of Mitanni visited the land of Amurru, and he said, 'How great is this land? Your land, Amurru, is extensive. Please, may the king of Egypt come with all speed and take everything back. Get archers. Abdi Ashurta is very ill. Who knows, when he dies, what might happen?'" End quote. So, soon after the Mitanni invasion, Abdi Ashurta got sick, maybe almost died. And Rabadi begged the pharaoh to seize the opportunity, to come forth with soldiers and reclaim everything that Abdi had taken. Once again, the king of Egypt was silent, and the situation dragged on. Abdi Ashurta's illness lingered for a while, but then he recovered. And when the lord of Amurru was back in fighting shape, he and his warriors began to lay waste to the countryside once more. Once again, their attacks focused on their neighbor, Rabadi of Byblos, and the warriors of Amurru, including that elusive group called Apiru, began to lay waste to the regions of Byblos. As this happened yet again, Rabadi wrote to the pharaoh, and he said, quote, "Though I keep writing like this to the king my lord, he does not heed my words. Abdi Ashurta has attacked me 3 times this year, and for 2 years I have been repeatedly robbed of my grain. We have no grain to eat. What can I say to my peasants? Their sons, their daughters, the furnishings of their houses are gone. They have been sold for provisions to keep us alive. May the king, my lord, heed the words of his loyal servant, and may he send grain in ships in order to keep his servant and his city, Byblos, alive." End quote. This is a dark but interesting record. It seems that the lord of Amurru began targeting the fields, the agricultural support base of Rabadi's kingdom. Stealing food was a good way to weaken your enemy and to strengthen your own cause, especially if the enemy was a mayor of a large city with a large population to keep happy and lots of hungry mouths to feed. The warriors of Amurru and the Apiru spread across the countryside of Lebanon like locusts devouring the crops. Desperate to overcome these challenges, Rabadi asked for food, basically for aid to keep his city and his population alive. He also asked for soldiers and for additional supplies in order to maintain the war effort and, hopefully, defeat Abdi Ashurta. In the rest of this letter, he said, quote, "May the king, my lord, grant 400 men and 30 pairs of horses with chariots, as were given to other cities, so that they may guard Byblos for you. The grain that used to be given to Sumer, may it now be given to Byblos, so that we may have provisions, until you give thought to your city." End quote. Rabadi begged the pharaoh to send supplies and warriors, and this time he needed even more troops. Presumably, the pharaoh had not responded earlier. Now the situation was worse, and instead of 200 men, Rabadi needed 400 to rectify the situation. Still, the king of Egypt was silent, and Rabadi's people limped on, their doom growing ever closer. By this time, all hope was fading. We now come to the end of chapter 2. Dark times are falling over Lebanon, and Abdi Ashirta is ascendant. After the break, we witness the final clash, and come to terms with how the Lord of Amurru was able to succeed with this audacious, reckless war. Who were his allies that he could betray Pharaoh like this? And who, pray tell, were these Apiru that kept showing up in his army? All that in chapter 3, after the music. See you in a moment. The power of Amurru grew, and the strength of Byblos failed. Rabadi, the mayor of Byblos, was in dire straits. He had barred the gates to anyone coming out of Amurru, and he considered himself and his city to be in a state of siege. Rabadi was at a loss, and in one more letter he begged the local Egyptian officials to act. Quote, "Message to Amanapa, an Egyptian name, from Rabadi. I fall at your feet. Behold, I was distressed, angry at your words, which said, quote, I am to make my way to you. You are always writing like this to me. Listen, tell the king to give you 300 men, so that we can visit the city and regain it for the pharaoh. Don't the royal officials long for the archers to come out? If we are able to seize the city of Batruna for you, then the men will abandon Abdi Ashirta. Things are not as they were previously. If there are no archers this year, then Abdi will be strong forever." End quote. The situation was dire, and by now the Egyptian officials were beginning to worry about Abdi Ashirta's strength. The lord of Amurru and his allies, the Apiru, had turned the kingdom from a tiny backwater into a modest regional power. Rabadi hammered that point home, and even suggested tentatively that Abdi Ashirta's power now seemed almost a rival to that of the pharaoh. In the same letter, the mayor of Byblos said, or quoted someone saying, "Abdi Ashirta is stronger than the king." End quote. By this point, the strength of Amurru perhaps seemed great enough that dislodging them would require a genuine Egyptian army. Still, the troops of Egypt remained at home. None were coming. At the end of chapter 2, we left Rabadi in a precarious situation. The mayor of Byblos was surrounded, and the enemy was raiding his farms. Food supplies were scarce, and he was begging the king of Egypt for assistance. Well, in the second part of that letter, Rabadi tried to find some resolution for his trouble. Since the pharaoh was not replying, Rabadi had no idea how his letters were being received. Was the king ignoring him on purpose, or was Egypt not sending supplies because there were none to be had? If only the mayor had more information, he could adjust his strategies, prepare for the future. If only Pharaoh would tell him something. In an almost heartbreaking letter, the mayor of Byblos said, quote, "Moreover, I swear, as the king my lord lives, truly my men are loyal to me. Abdi Ashirta and the Apiru have gone to the prince of Beirut, so that an alliance may be formed between them. Send a garrison to protect your land, lest your city be seized. Listen to me. Why do you not at least say to me, that which my servant requests is available or is unavailable? That way I may know what I should do until the king arrives and visits his royal servant. Who is Abdi Ashirta, the servant and dog, that men even mention his name in the very presence of the king? Just let there be one man whose heart is in agreement with my heart, and I would drive Abdi Ashurta from the land of Amurru. May the king heed the words of his servant. May he give men to guard his city, lest Abdi Ashurta gather all of the Apuru, and they seize this town. Send a large force, so that they may drive the enemy from the land of Amurru. When the commissioner of the king was with us, it was to him that we used to write. We cannot write to him now." End quote. The translator of this letter, William Moran, gives it a dark title. He calls it "Nothing to Eat," and this seems fitting with Rabadi's dire straits. Byblos was effectively under siege. Even if there were no ladders at the walls yet, the farms were despoiled and the hinterland was empty. If relief did not arrive soon, in the form of soldiers and food, then Byblos would have no choice but to surrender. If Pharaoh did not act, he risked losing his most valuable city in the region. Rabadi watched as Abdi Ashurta slowly expanded his borders. With growing concern, the mayor of Byblos sent letter after letter, warning the Egyptian representatives and the pharaoh, their overlord, of the threat which Abdi and the Apuru posed to the region. Eventually, the situation became truly precarious. As Abdi Ashurta and the Apuru bandits spread across the land, the mayor of Byblos slowly lost control over the last vestiges of his territory. Eventually, the day came. The warriors of Amurru were at the gates of Byblos itself. The struggle had now become a calamity, and in a string of letters, Rabadi begged for assistance. He said, quote, "Now he has taken Batruna, and he has moved up against me. Behold the city, he has warriors at the entrance of the gate of Byblos. For a long time he has not moved from the gate, and so we are unable to go out into the countryside." Soon after this, Rabadi also said, quote, "Be informed, the war against me is severe. He has taken all of my cities. Byblos alone remains to me. I was in Shigata, and I wrote to you, but you did not listen to me. Then from Batruna I wrote to you. My words went unheeded. Now they have taken my cities. What can I do by myself? You have been negligent of your cities, so that the Apuru dog takes them. It is to you that I have turned. All the other mayors are at peace with Abdi Ashurta." End quote. Finally, the enemy warriors began to raid Byblos itself. Rabadi, desperate lest he lose his city and his life, wrote once more, quote, "I fall at the feet of my lord 7 times and 7 times. Why have you sat idly by and done nothing, so that the Apuru dog takes your cities? When he, Abdi Ashurta, saw that no one said anything to him about Sumer, his intentions were reinforced and grew bolder. As a result, he strives to take Byblos. He has attacked me and my orchards, and my own men have become hostile to me. I have been plundered of grain. Please, may you pay 1,000 shekels of silver and 100 shekels of gold, so that Abdi Ashurta will go away from me. He has taken all of my cities. Byblos alone remains." End quote. Byblos was now under siege. It was a dire situation. Without relief, the city would fall, and Abdi Ashurta, ruler of Amurru, would have established a new kingdom, a new power in the region. For the ruler of the city, a day of destruction seemed imminent.
"They have taken the bridge and the second hall. We have barred the gates, but cannot hold them for long. The ground shakes. Drums in the deep. We cannot get out. A shadow moves in the dark. We cannot get out. They are coming."
With Byblos on its knees, the might of Amurru was stable, at least regionally. The Mitanni invasion had dissipated, with no real gains. Abdi had gone along with the king of Mitanni, and perhaps sworn some kind of loyalty to him. But the threat of that king was once again safely in the east. For now, Abdi's real concern was the pharaoh. He probably wasn't too worried. So far, it had all worked very well, and he had succeeded in every endeavour he pursued. Then again, maybe Abdi should have worried. The Prince of Amurru had been successful, yes, but that success, perhaps, owed as much to the instability of the time as they did to any particular genius for politics. Abdi Ashirta seems almost comical in his transparency. For every letter protesting his loyalty to the pharaoh, there are a dozen letters spelling out his disregard for the peace of the king's empire. Eventually, it would be this disregard that finally brought Abdi to his knees. At some point, the Egyptian government finally responded to the threat of Amurru. It's not exactly clear what happened, but just as Abdi Ashirta was reaching his greatest prominence, the Lord of Amurru was suddenly overthrown. How this happened is a matter of debate, and it rests primarily on the letters of our man on the scene, Rebadi. For all his terror, the mayor of Byblos survived the siege, and he emerged from the Amurru crisis with his life and home intact. As the darkness receded, Rebadi continued sending messages to the king of Egypt, and from these letters we get a slightly confusing picture of events. According to one message, Abdi Ashirta may have been overthrown by his own people. A message to the pharaoh reports how, in a startling turn of events, Abdi may have been the victim of a mutiny. According to this letter, Abdi Ashirta's own people, the Amurrites, deposed him because they were lacking certain goods required for tribute. The letter says, quote, "The ships of the army must not enter the land of Amurru, for they, the Amurrites, have killed Abdi Ashirta. They did this because they had no wool, and he had no garments of lapis lazuli, or Ma stone colour to give as tribute to the land of Mitanni." End quote. Now, this is interesting. According to Rebadi's first letter, the Lord of Amurru died because he failed to gather the goods needed to pay Mitanni. Back in Chapter 2, we witnessed a surprise invasion as the king of Mitanni swept into Amurru and plundered it. When he did this, the Mitanni king captured Abdi Ashirta and took him away, holding him briefly before releasing him. Perhaps the king of Mitanni released Abdi Ashirta for a price, a ransom, and when Abdi did not gather it in time, some of his followers may have murdered him. This would be a dark end, but perhaps no more than the Lord of Amurru deserved. Abdi Ashirta had gone rogue against his overlord, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and if he had also broken a covenant with the Mitanni, well, there are prices for such deceit. That's one possibility of what happened. The second, also recorded by Rebadi, seemed to present something entirely different. In another letter to the pharaoh, the mayor of Byblos suggested that Abdi Ashirta died at the hands and justice of Egypt itself. This letter says, quote, "Rebadi writes to his lord, the king of all countries, great king, king of battle, etc., etc. I am your loyal servant, and whatever I know or have heard, I report to the king, my lord. Who are they, the dogs, that they could resist the archers of the king? I wrote to your father, and he heeded my words, and he sent archers. Did your father not take Abdi Ashirta for himself?" End quote. This letter almost certainly dates to the reign of Akhenaten, and it's one of the best indicators that the deeds of Abdi Ashirta belonged to the later years of Amunhotep III. Rebadi makes reference to the pharaoh's father, which chronologically can only be Amunhotep. But that doesn't solve the question of why this letter presents an entirely different explanation for how Abdi Ashirta died. In the first message, Rebadi suggested that Abdi fell as a result of a mutiny. Now, the mayor of Byblos was suggesting that actually it was soldiers of Egypt that captured Abdi Ashirta. It would be difficult to reconcile these two accounts without some kind of conspiracy in the kingdom of Amurru. So what gives? Another letter, again from Rebadi, repeats the claim that Egypt, not Mitanni, was responsible for Abdi Ashirta's downfall. Again, a few years after these events, Rabadi wrote a letter to Akhenaten. In it, he referenced the death of Abdi Ashirta. This time, though, he actually backed his claim up with some names. The mayor of Byblos said, quote, Reb-Adi writes to his lord, the great king, the king of battle. Previously, I sent a man to your father. When Amanarpa, presumably an Egyptian official, came with a small force, I wrote to the palace that the king should send a large force. Did he, the king, not take Abdi Ashirta along with everything belonging to him, just as I said? End quote. Finally, we have some details. According to this version of events, the pharaoh Amunhotep III finally acted and sent an official to Lebanon. The Egyptian governor came with troops, perhaps by ship, and took Abdi Ashirta prisoner. After that, it's not clear what happened. If we follow Reb-Adi's account, and assuming we trust him to tell everything accurately, it seems that Abdi Ashirta was arrested on the pharaoh's orders. At long last, his deeds caught up with him, and the lord of Amurru met his end, executed on Egyptian soil. Alternatively, though, it's possible he was murdered by his own countrymen, who had lost faith in his leadership or were concerned about reprisals from Mitanni. Whichever interpretation you take, the result was the same. Overnight, Abdi Ashirta was gone. Just like that, the threat was ended. Byblos was saved. The Mediterranean coast was back under Pharaoh's command. The lord of Amurru, mighty ruler of a regional power, fell to the justice of the king. Which king is unclear, but a king nonetheless. For his crimes, Abdi's life was forfeit, and justice took its due. All of a sudden, the threat of Amurru that had seemed so dire was over, and there was much rejoicing. The dark days of Abdi Ashirta's rise and his war against Byblos were over. The overall narrative, the chronology of events, is difficult to put together with certainty, but if we look at the big picture, some basic elements seem clear. After beginning his reign as a loyal vassal, one put in power by the king of Egypt, Abdi Ashirta began to act on his own initiative. He started expanding his kingdom, gobbling up small towns and forcing local elites to submit to his authority. He did this by allying with local bands or tribes, groups known as the Apiru or outlaws. With their support, the lord of Amurru could send out war parties to harass his neighbors. At the same time, he could deny any responsibility for the crimes of these brigands. Abdi's motivations are probably lost forever. He was certainly scrupulous in declaring his loyalty to the pharaoh, but his deeds suggest otherwise, and it's hard to know what exactly he was trying to achieve. Challenging the king of Egypt was a no-win situation for Amurru. Pharaoh's military and economic resources were in a whole other league, and when the time came for a reckoning, Abdi's fall certainly seems to have been swift. So what did Abdi Ashirta hope to gain from his deeds? The easiest explanation is that Abdi did it because he could. Knowing that Egypt was far away and the pharaoh disinterested, Abdi Ashirta may have felt that the risk was smaller than the potential reward. Alternatively, the rewards themselves may have been his primary motivation. As ruler of a small backwater kingdom, the lord of Amurru may have felt that he deserved more, or perhaps he craved access to the Mediterranean trade network along the Lebanese coast. It certainly seems that Abdi's efforts focused on the towns near to the sea. Perhaps wealth was his primary goal. If that's the case, it didn't help him in the end. At least one explanation for Abdi's death was that he failed to gather enough plunder to pay the tributes he owed. Speaking of tribute, another explanation is more generous. Abdi Ashirta may have waged his wars and captured towns so that he could strengthen his kingdom against outside threats. The letters which Abdi sent to the pharaoh are consistent, mentioning enemies surrounding him and a war pressing in on his borders. It's entirely possible he was telling the truth. In Chapter 2, we saw how the king of Mitanni paid a visit, or invaded, the land of Amurru. The Mitanni lord came in with chariots and troops and plundered the region, even capturing Abdi himself and taking him away. Abdi gained his freedom, but he probably had to promise tribute or ransom to the Mitanni king. This whole situation certainly suggests that Abdi was telling the truth in some form. Perhaps the threat to his kingdom was genuine and quite serious. And if we consider Rebadi's letter that suggests Abdi Ashurta died because he couldn't get enough tribute for the king of Mitanni, well, that kind of adds to the seriousness. In his own letters to Pharaoh, Abdi refers to, quote, the kings of the Hurrian lands, or Mitanni, as his enemies. So it's possible that his struggles were at least partly a defensive measure. If Abdi made Amurru strong, then it could resist Mitanni with greater strength. Maybe, just maybe, these wars were part of a larger conflict spreading across the Near East. I'm guessing here, but it's possible that the king of Mitanni tried to force countries like Amurru to join his empire. Perhaps Abdi Ashurta was simply caught up in the games of the powerful. So Abdi's motivations are unclear. Perhaps he was an aggressive warmonger, or perhaps he had serious concerns about his security and pursued every option that he could. But this doesn't fully explain why the pharaoh seemed reluctant to act. Even if Abdi's concerns were real, why did the king of Egypt allow him to expand into the Egyptian empire? There are at least two possible reasons why the pharaoh may have waited before responding to Abdi's expansion. The many letters from Rebadi of Byblos paint a dramatic picture, but they only show one part of the overall story. So we have to look at other sources to get a sense of why the king of Egypt did not intervene and halt Abdi at the outset. From archaeological studies, we know that the major bastions of Egypt's power, the fortresses, were not particularly large or impressive during the 18th dynasty. In other words, the Egyptians weren't investing huge resources into controlling or dominating the area of Canaan. Instead, they seem to have had a light hand or laissez-faire approach. The fortresses in this area were small, mainly storehouses for supplies and weapons. The garrisons were probably equally small and dispersed across several major centers. Rather than have a dozen generals or overseers stomping up and down the country, perhaps the Egyptian government empowered a few men to oversee events in the big picture. In other words, it seems like the Egyptian empire operated on slightly different rules than in the past. A few generations back, warrior pharaohs had swept through the area, conquering cities and subjugating foes. But the recent past had seen a greater emphasis on diplomacy and administration. The days of annual campaigning were long gone. Perhaps royal interventions had become less common as well. If the idea of a light-hand approach is accurate, then it may give us an explanation for the pharaoh's silence. Perhaps the king of Egypt didn't respond to Rebadi because he didn't particularly care whether Abdi Ashurta was powerful or not. Let's unpack that for a second. Bearing in mind that the Canaanite fortresses were small and the Egyptian policy more hands-off, it's possible that another part of Pharaoh's strategy was to let the locals sort their own problems out. After all, did it really matter to Pharaoh if Rebadi or Abdi Ashurta was top dog in Lebanon? Surely, what mattered most was that the local leader paid his tribute and continued to give his loyalty to Egypt. As long as Abdi Ashurta paid his annual fees, perhaps he could do as he wished. It's possible that the pharaoh did not really care which Canaanite ruler was more prominent. So long as the overall system remained stable, then the local details were inconsequential. This interpretation is speculative, even if we base it on archaeological remains and a creative reading of the Amarna letters themselves. Obviously, it would be short-sighted for any ruler to let his vassals go rogue and gobble up parts of his empire. Even if the overall system was stable, small changes could still cause massive disruptions in the wider community. Maybe that's why Pharaoh did eventually remove Abdi Ashurta. While the Lord of Amurru could expand a little bit, there were limits to what the king would allow. Perhaps the siege of Byblos was the straw that broke the camel's back. Capturing small coastal towns, even a bastion like Sumer, was permissible, but messing with a vital trade city, one of Egypt's oldest allies, maybe that was going too far. When Abdi Ashurta took minor villages and ports, that was one thing. When he attacked Byblos directly, perhaps that was crossing the line. Putting all of this together, Abdi Ashurta's rise is a complex but fascinating little story. In building his kingdom up from a local backwater to regional power, the Lord of Amurru made great strides. Abdi was cunning, playing his cards well and using diplomatic and strategic tools to great effect. With a mix of sneak attacks, deception, and misinformation, the Lord of Amurru obscured the reality of what he was doing. Although we can look back and see Amurru expanding at the expense of the Egyptian Empire, things were probably not as clear-cut for those living in the moment. For every report that arrived at the pharaoh's palace, and every letter from his many, many vassals, the king of Egypt may have been unsure exactly what was happening 1,000 kilometers away. This would explain how Abdi was able to get away with his aggressive movements for so long. It would also explain how the next phase of these international troubles would play out. Just as the blood of Abdi Ashurta spilled and the warlord's career ended, a new generation would come to power. Before too long, Abdi Ashurta's sons would make their own mark on the world. Thank you for joining me on this extra long journey through Bronze Age diplomacy. If you've made it to the end, congratulations. Allow me to extend my thanks for your listenership and your support. On the next episode of the History of Egypt podcast, we will find the kingdom of Amurru moving once again. Although Abdi Ashurta was dead, his power did not disappear. Instead, the mantle passed to Abdi's sons, a group that inherited all of their father's cunning and doubled down on his aggressiveness. We now reach Chapter 2 in the Amurrite story. This concerns the son of Abdi Ashurta. His name was Aziru. When he died, Abdi Ashurta left behind sons, multiple young men who were willing and able to carry his legacy. These brothers, often known as the sons of Abdi Ashurta, were going to cause great havoc, just like their father before. But first, they had to gain permission to inherit their father's status. Abdi's sons were led by a man named Aziru. Aziru, or helper in the local language, was probably a mature man when his father died. He and his brothers inherited what authority was left in the royal household, and pretty soon they started communicating with the Egyptians. Aziru and his brothers wanted to be recognized as vassals, official servants of the Egyptian pharaoh. Being a vassal had its perks. It gave you access to imperial administration and officials, and pharaoh's military protection or guarantees. For young men new to politics, this might have been an attractive proposition. So, not long after their father died, Aziru and his brothers started asking Egypt to recognize them. That would take some time, though. Following Abdi Ashurta's death, the Egyptian officials responsible for this region probably had their hands full undoing much of his work. There were towns to rebuild and repair, farming communities to restore, ships to construct, and tribute to gather. From their bastion of Sumer, a fortified town near the coast, Egyptian governors, or commissioners, were probably quite busy restoring their authority in the region. So when young Aziru and his brothers came calling, they probably got short shrift for their requests. It seems that the Egyptian officials, Pharaoh's representatives, refused to acknowledge Aziru for quite some time. We know this because Aziru himself wrote to the king of Egypt, complaining about the situation. Some time after his father's death, Aziru wrote to the pharaoh, promising to meet any request that the king might have, and denouncing those who said that he and his brothers were unfit to be vassals. Aziru said, quote, "Say to the king, my lord, my god, my son, message of Aziru, your servant, I fall at the feet of my lord 7 times and 7 times. May the king, my lord, know that I am your servant forever. I do not deviate from the orders of my lord. From the very first I have wanted to enter the service of the king, but the magnates of Sumer do not permit me. I am innocent of dereliction of duty or the slightest thing against the king. The king, my lord, knows who the real rebels are, and whatever the other mayors have given, I too will give these to the king, my lord, my god, my son. I will give this forever." End quote. So, Aziru wrote a letter promising his loyalty and requesting recognition. Did it work? Well, sort of. We don't know if the pharaoh wrote back directly, but other letters indicate that one of Egypt's high officials did get in touch. One of Akhenaten's administrators, a man named Tutu, starts to appear in the record corresponding with Aziru. We will meet Tutu properly in a later episode. For now, it's enough to know that he was a high official close to the king who reported on the affairs of Akhenaten's vassals. In this capacity, Tutu dealt with Aziru directly. One of the letters gives a taste of how Aziru and Tutu negotiated the new relationship between Egypt and Amurru. Aziru promised all the riches that his country could provide if Tutu and Egypt would treat him as a friend. Aziru's message said, quote, "For Tutu, my lord, my father, message of Aziru, your son, your servant. I fall at the feet of my father, or lord. For my father, may all go well. Tutu, I hereby grant the request of the king, my lord, and whatever may be the request of the king, he should write it, and I will grant it. Likewise, as you are in the court, whatever may be the request of Tutu, just write, and I will grant it. As you are my father, and I am your son, the land of Amurru is your land, and my house is your house." End quote. Aziru wrote to the official as a father and a lord, reflecting his subservience towards the pharaoh's representative. The father title is not literal, it's honorary. Because Tutu had power over Aziru, he was like a father who had power over his children. Accordingly, Aziru gave Tutu his obedience, as a son should. Whatever Tutu or the king might need, Aziru was happy to comply. The next set of events is unclear, but it seems like Aziru did get Egypt's recognition eventually. At some point, the pharaoh acknowledged him as a vassal, and Amurru became, once again, a valid partner in Egypt's imperial network. It's surprising that Akhenaten did not choose to replace Aziru's family with one that was more trustworthy. He allowed the sons of Abdi Ashirta to inherit their father's position, instead of dividing that power up and giving it to other vassals. We can't be sure why. Some scholars suggest that the Amurrites had allies at the court, who whispered in Akhenaten's ear. That's possible, but it's equally possible that Akhenaten and his officials saw the value in keeping an established family in power, rather than trying to reshape the kingdom entirely. Continuity is always useful in politics, then and now, especially when dealing with foreign affairs. Perhaps for Akhenaten and Tutu, the sons of Abdi Ashirta were a more promising bet than some other family or group. Akhenaten let his governors handle affairs in Lebanon, and then eventually recognized Aziru as a vassal. Perhaps the pharaoh was distracted by other business, perhaps he didn't care that much, or perhaps the delay was a punishment, a warning to the princes that their father's crimes were not forgotten. It's possible that Aziru and his kin had to wait years before gaining the acknowledgement they desired. These kinds of delays would have consequences down the line. Many years passed between the death of Abdi Ashirta and the rise of Aziru. We are not sure exactly how long, but it seems to have been a reasonable length of time. Long enough for life to go back to normal, for prosperity and trade to return, and for the old threats to diminish. Slowly, the towns and villages that had suffered in the recent chaos began to enjoy prosperity once more. It was then that the sons of Abdi Ashirta chose to strike. Sometime in Akhenaten's reign, possibly around year 10, Aziru and his brothers began to take Amurru in an aggressive direction once more. Their first moves are unclear, but it seems they started by visiting the neighbouring towns and leaders and convincing them to ally or join with Amurru. Maybe the brothers offered perks, like greater access to trade, or maybe they bullied and coerced them. Either way, prominent towns and leaders began to make formal agreements with Amurru. Pretty soon, the sons of Abdi Ashirta held sway over several important lands. The Lebanese coast at this time was divided among several major cities. The most important were Byblos, a trade city from way back, and Sumer, the fortified bastion of Egypt's administration. Sumer was probably the most important town in the area, Byblos a close second. The Egyptian officials or commissioners used Sumer as their center of operations, and it was where Pharaoh's ships and troops landed when patrolling the region. Sumer was also the first target for any outside attacker. Right from the get-go, Aziru and his brothers focused on isolating the town of Sumer. They made alliances with the people living around Sumer, forming agreements with local leaders in order to deprive the Egyptian bastion of its support. This strategy was quite successful, and very soon the Amurrites had turned Sumer into a tiny outpost surrounded by hostile territory. We hear about this in a letter from one of Egypt's vassals observing the situation. South of Sumer, the mayor of Beirut was watching these affairs. Beirut, or Biruta in the local language, is a truly ancient city, one of the oldest continuously inhabited towns on Earth. Back in 1350 BCE, Beirut was a small but noteworthy community. Its mayor, a man named Yapa Hada, observed the strategy which Aziru and his brothers were pursuing. He reported this and his concerns to the Egyptians. Quote, "To the Egyptian commissioner, message of Yapa Hada, saying, 'Why have you become neglectful of Sumer? All of the lands between Byblos and Ugarit have become enemies in the service of Aziru. The towns of Shigata and Ampi are enemies. Aziru has stationed ships so that grain cannot be brought into Sumer, nor are we able to enter Sumer, so what can we do to help? Write to the king's palace about this matter. It is good that you be informed.'" End quote. Right out the gate, Aziru and his brothers began to re-establish the kingdom that their late father had created. Coastal towns like Shigata and Ampi were brought back into the fold. Smaller areas capitulated as well, and soon Aziru commanded followers throughout the region, from Byblos to Ugarit. Ugarit and Byblos themselves remained free, but everything between those cities was swallowed up by the resurgent Amurrite kingdom. The mayor of Beirut, Yapa Hada, watched with alarm. As the sons of Abdi Ashirta began their conquests, another neighbour popped up to report on the situation. We've met this chap before, the mayor of Byblos, Rebadi, who had been the correspondent-in-chief during Abdi Ashirta's reign of terror. Rebadi sent dozens of messages to the Egyptian court describing events in Lebanon. Naturally, when Aziru and his brothers came along, Rebadi was quick to report. Quote, "Say to the king, my lord, my sun god, message of Rebadi, your servant. May the king, my lord, know that Pu Bakhla, a son of Abdi Ashirta, has occupied the city of Ulasa. The cities of Adarta, Wakhila, Ampi, and Shigata are theirs also. All of the cities are theirs. So may the king send troops to Sumer until he gives thought to this land." End quote. Rebadi was no fool. He could see where this was going, and he warned the king that what had happened once could happen again. In the second half of that letter, Rebadi denounced his foes and foretold the consequences if the king did not act soon. He said, quote, Who are the sons of Abdi Ashirta? Are they the king of Nubia or the king of Mitanni, that they take the land of the pharaoh for themselves? Previously, they would take cities of the mayors, and you did nothing. Now, they have even driven out your commissioner, and have taken his cities for themselves. They are certainly going to take Sumer and kill the commissioner, and the garrison which is in Sumer. What am I to do? I cannot personally go to Sumer. The cities of Ampi, Shigata, Ulatsa, and Awada are at war with me now. Should they hear that I was entering Sumer, they would attack me, and Byblos would be joined to the Apiru. End quote. Basically, the sons of Abdi Ashirta had captured numerous major communities, and were now using the resources of those towns to isolate Sumer and to starve it out. Once again, Rabadi talks about a group called the Apiru. These are the outlaws or refugees, quote-unquote, of Canaanite society. We met the Apiru in episode 123, where we explored their role and status in Near Eastern society. Also, we investigated the possibility that the Apiru are an early ancestor or proto-form of the biblical Hebrews. There is no firm conclusion on that question, no scholarly consensus, but it's possible. Either way, the Apiru brigands did not vanish with the death of Abdi Ashirta. They remained, in their small bands and communities, a potential source of manpower for whoever had the foresight to use them. Naturally, Aziru and his brothers took up that opportunity, and as the new war for Lebanon began, the Apiru were on the front lines. Aziru and his brothers surrounded the town of Sumer, using their allies to isolate the Egyptian bastion. The Lebanese mayors, including Rebadi, tried to send aid to Sumer. They dispatched ships, but these were waylaid by the vessels of Amurru. They sent messengers, but these were detained as well. And all the while, Aziru and his brothers were working to coerce and convince other leaders to join their kingdom in alliance. Eventually, the sons of Abdi Ashirta succeeded in taking one of Egypt's vassals. Not long after he sent his message to Egypt, the mayor of Beirut, Yapa Hada, decided to switch sides. Caving into pressure, he joined with the sons of Abdi Ashirta, lending his resources to theirs. This treachery was reported by Rabadi, who lamented that Beirut, like so many others, was now lost to the enemy. The mayor of Byblos reported dutifully what was happening. Quote, "May the king take counsel concerning the king of Sumer. Behold, like a bird trapped inside a cage, thus is the city of Sumer. The sons of Abdi Ashirta, day and night they are against it. All the property of Abdi Ashirta was given to his sons, so now they are strong, and they even took the ships of the army with their supplies. So I am unable to go to the aid of the city of Sumer. Furthermore, my lord, Yapa Hada is hostile to me because of my property that is with him. Yapa Hada does not let my ships go, nor can I send them to Sumer because of the enemy's ships." End quote. Sumer was caught like a bird in a cage, and the enemy's ships now patrolled the coast, preventing passage to any who opposed them. Rabadi sought to aid Sumer, but his efforts were blocked. Traffic on the eastern Mediterranean coast halted, which meant that supplies and grain shipments could not reach the beleaguered Egyptian bastion. Pretty soon, Egypt's outpost in Lebanon was effectively under siege. Aziru and his brothers swept to prominence rapidly. Like their father, they allied with local brigands, the Apiru, and began to coerce other leaders into joining them. The brothers were extraordinarily successful. Capitalizing on their late father's accomplishments, they were able to rebuild his kingdom quickly. Within just a few years of gaining power, the sons of Abdi Ashirta had brought Amurru back to regional prominence. What came next was, to put it mildly, a rapid slide into chaos and despair. Fun times. We now come to the end of Chapter 1. After the break, the crisis deepens. Amurru was on the rise, and its neighbours were greatly concerned. Of course, none were more alarmed than Rabadi. The mayor of Byblos had seen this story before, and he was anxious to avoid a repeat. Unfortunately for him, Rebadi was not the only force at work. As Aziru and his brothers rebuilt their kingdom, the gods themselves made their own mark on events. While human agents wrought destruction, Lebanon and its people would suffer the devastating consequences of plague. That is Chapter 2, after the break. The year was approximately 1350 BCE. Maybe. It could have been earlier, could have been later. We don't know. What we do know is that sometime during the reign of Akhenaten, the kingdom of Amurru was back. After an early rise, a serious setback, and the death of Abdi Ashirta, a new generation had begun restoring its fortunes. The sons of Abdi had great success, inheriting their father's power and rapidly recovering much of what he had lost. Now, Aziru and his brothers were growing bolder. They isolated their enemies' towns, most notably the Egyptian bastion Sumer. Soon, the sons of Abdi Ashirta controlled much of the Lebanese highlands and the coast. As the rise of Amurru moved into its second phase, a local ruler watched, horrified, as history seemed to repeat. The mayor of Byblos, Rebadi, had witnessed the first rise, and he was in no mood to endure a second. As the sons of Abdi Ashirta began their expansion, Rebadi was quick to denounce them. He spoke of the, quote, sons of Abdi Ashirta, the dog of your house, and declared, quote, the sons of Abdi Ashirta are hostile to the king, end quote. As the mayor of Byblos observed this new generation, he clearly held no illusions about the threat that they posed. City-states, towns, and villages fell to Aziru and his brothers, and Rebadi reported to the king. When the mayor of Beirut, a noteworthy town, betrayed Egypt and went over to the Amurrites, Rebadi reported to the king. And as Aziru's warriors and ships isolated the imperial bastion of Sumer, Rebadi reported it all. Quote, Rebadi says to his lord, the great king, king of all countries, I fall at the feet of my lord 7 times and 7 times. Gubla, or Byblos, is the loyal city of my lord since ancient times, and I am a footstool for the feet of the king. Now, as for Sumer, the war against it is severe, and it is severe against me also. Sumer is now raided up to its city gate. The enemy have been able to raid it, but they have not been able to capture it. I was in Sumer, and all of its people fled. May my lord send a commissioner and soldiers with him, so that they may guard the city. End quote. If we take this letter at face value, it appears that Aziru, his brothers, and their warriors were in the process of raiding the hinterlands. They could not capture the city of Sumer itself, for it was well fortified. But they could plunder the outlying villages and steal the crops. They could ransack homesteads and capture anyone outside the walls. Beyond the fortifications of the major towns, the authority of Egypt's representatives and their ability to guarantee security was rapidly collapsing. Naturally, this kind of crisis would have triggered migrations. Outside of the fortified towns, people living in farmsteads and villages were vulnerable to attack. Many families, even whole communities, would have fled as Aziru and his warriors spread across the region. Some may have gone to Sumer, others to Byblos, and many more may have tried to get as far away as possible. Either way, the population of the region was on the move, people crowded together, clustering in the areas they thought safe. Unfortunately, this kind of density triggered its own chaotic fallout. As the enemy warriors spread through the countryside, panicked families gathered their belongings and headed for safety. They collected their food, bundled up their valuables, and carried their children away from the threat. They also would have taken their animals. Bronze Age society was, in general, far more pastoral than the industrialized world. Animals and humans lived in much greater proximity, sharing the same fields and the same houses. The family home was also a stable for many kinds of livestock. whether it was the donkeys that carried their goods, the goats and sheep who provided their meat, or the cattle who dispensed milk. The people of this world lived in far closer contact with their animal providers. So, as the enemy despoiled farms, the farmers and their animals thronged towards the major towns. Crowds and herds moved towards Sumer and Byblos, and as they streamed through the gates, the cities rapidly filled to bursting. In crowded alleys and packed compounds, humans and animals rubbed against each other, in spaces that were never meant to hold such numbers. The infrastructure of these cities would have started to suffer. Sanitation, like drain pipes and waste dumps, would have broken down under a surging demand, and sewage waste would become an even greater problem in the towns. Naturally, the combination of overcrowding, widespread anxiety, and multi-species proximity soon led to disease. At some point in the days of Aziru, letters from the Syrian and Canaanite princes report the appearance of a plague, or Mutanu. We do not know where it started, but it appears in multiple spots simultaneously. From Lebanon to Cyprus to Egypt and Turkey, a pestilence began to afflict the communities. The Amarna letters give us a glimpse of what happened and how people responded to it. The Egyptian archives begin to reveal reports. From Lebanon, the first comes from Rabadi, or rather, from a message to Rabadi. This was written by one of the Egyptian governors. An imperial official, unnamed, had apparently asked Rabadi to take some men and donkeys from the town of Sumer to Byblos. Rabadi, though, refused, on the grounds that Sumer was experiencing an outbreak. To protect his city, the mayor of Byblos was unwilling to take the donkeys. The Egyptian governor was furious at Rabadi's refusal, and he wrote back sharply. The governor said, quote, "Say to Rabadi, my son or servant, message of the general, your father. May the god show concern for you and your household. But as far as your saying to me, quote, I will not permit men from Sumer to enter Byblos, for there is a plague in the town of Sumer. Well, I say to you, Rabadi, is this a plague affecting men or one affecting asses, donkeys? What plague affects asses so that they cannot walk? Watch yourself. Do the asses belong to the king, or do they not? If the king is the owner of these asses, then look for them. Why do you act this way towards servants of the king? Send your men to guard Sumer. I am writing to the king about you. He is to reply to me by tablet concerning this whole affair." End quote. Yikes, Rabadi was in trouble, but not without good reason. As Sumer crowded with people and animals, the plague arrived as well. While some of the animals may have been unaffected, in this case the asses or donkeys, Rabadi was taking no chances. He refused entry to the men and sent them back to Sumer. For this, he was castigated. It is hard to fault Rabadi's response to the situation. The mayor of Byblos was a loyal vassal to Egypt, but his responsibility was, first and foremost, his own town. The people of Byblos and its animals were more important than the donkeys or asses of Sumer. No matter who the donkeys belonged to, in principle, Rabadi judged them a threat to his community. Faced with the prospect of plague, Rabadi tried to bar his gates to anyone coming out of Sumer. We do not know if he was successful, or if political pressure from the Egyptian governors overcame his reservations. All we know is that Rabadi tried to protest, and the imperial officials were having none of it. This plague was not isolated. There was no quarantine. The spectre of disease swept through the region unrestricted, striking down many in the towns and villages. It is hard to measure the impact based on the few references we have, but we do know that the plague travelled far. Not only did disease strike Lebanon, it even crossed the sea. Riding the ships and winds, the pestilence flew from the mainland until it reached the island of Cyprus. Cyprus, or Alashia in the ancient name, was a distant island in the eastern Mediterranean. It was famous for its copper, from which we get the Greek name Kupros, or Cyprus, and for many years the Cypriots had sent their copper to Egypt. The king of Alashia reported to Akhenaten when plague came to his island. One of the letters discovered at Amarna concerns a delivery of copper, which under normal circumstances would be a routine matter. Unfortunately, this delivery was going to be much smaller than usual, and the king of Alashia was anxious that the pharaoh not be alarmed or insulted by the deficit. Concerning the shortage of copper, he said, there was a very good reason. Quote, "Say to the king of the land of Egypt, my brother, thus the king of the land of Alashia, your brother. May all be well with my brother, with your palace, your wives, your sons, your officials, your horses, your chariots, and within your lands may all be very well. My brother, I have sent to you 500 weights of copper. I have sent this copper to you as a greeting gift. Now, the amount of copper is small, but do not take it to heart. You see, the hand of Nergal, my lord, is in my land. He has smitten all of the men of my land, and there are no copper workers left. So, my brother, may it not be taken to your heart that the amount of copper is small. Send your envoy back with my envoy, and whatever copper that you request, my brother, I will send it to you." End quote. Cyprus, it seems, was in trouble. According to this letter, the island was suffering under the hand of Nergal. Nergal is a Mesopotamian god, whose authority expressed itself most clearly in the form of plague. Pestilence and disease spread at the whim of Nergal, who, although filling many roles, is most commonly associated with the Near Eastern underworld. Nergal is complicated, but his influence was clear to those living on the island. Plague struck the people of Cyprus, Alashia, and it hit their poor first. The miners extracting copper from the hills suffered easily from pestilence. Overworked, probably underfed, and living in cramped, unpleasant conditions, Cyprus copper workers and excavators perished in large numbers. Sadly, their king acknowledged their deaths mainly as a factor in his economic troubles. Sometimes it seems that things will never change. But we can offer a prayer to these lost workers of Cyprus. Eventually, the disease passed. We are not sure when, but the references to plague vanish from the Amarna letters as suddenly as they appeared. Perhaps it was a small outbreak, perhaps the locals didn't report it as much as they should. Either way, the information disappears. We can only presume that eventually life returned to normal. Well, as normal as it could be. For Reb Adi, these were dark days indeed. His neighbours on all sides had allied with Aziru, and once again Byblos found itself isolated. To the north, the Egyptian bastion of Sumer was being raided, and if that bastion fell, then surely the lords of Amurru would turn their attention to Byblos itself. For the mayor, this was a time of great threat, as serious as that which Abdi Ashurta had presented just a few years ago. While he had endured these things before, we could forgive Reb Adi if he was feeling more than a little dejected by the times in which he lived. The mayor of Byblos had seen much and suffered many stresses and worries during his time in power. If he was feeling this way, then the pharaoh's response to one of his letters may have been even more discouraging. A couple of letters from Reb Adi refer to a message which the king of Egypt sent to him. We don't have the message itself, but Reb Adi quotes it, so we have a sense of what Akhenaten said with regard to Reb Adi's many letters. Apparently, the pharaoh of Egypt complained, quote, "You, Reb Adi, are the one that writes to me more than all of the other mayors. Why does Reb Adi keep sending a tablet this way to the palace? He is more distraught than his brothers about Sumer." End quote. Well, this was certainly disheartening. After all of Reb Adi's efforts to keep the pharaoh abreast of events, his reward was a complaint. The king of Egypt grew tired of the mayor of Byblos and the endless stream of tablets that issued forth from his town. Eventually, Akhenaten wrote back saying, in more polite terms, "Please, be quiet." It is hard to know what we should make of this. Perhaps Reb Adi was sending too many messages. Certainly, his letters make up a significant chunk of the surviving Amarna corpus. Out of 380 tablets identified so far, more than 60 come from the mayor of Byblos. So, yeah, he did write a lot. And maybe there were limits to Akhenaten's patience. I mean, how many times can you receive the same sort of message before you want to say, "Enough, I get it"? Naturally, these messages have influenced how historians understand Akhenaten and his attitude towards the empire. For some scholars, the king of Egypt comes across as an inattentive ruler, one disinterested in the empire and its business. Well, that may be a mistake, and in an upcoming episode we will tackle that myth head-on. For now, it's enough to say that 1. Akhenaten was more active than people realize, and 2. The letters themselves are too fragmentary to allow such sweeping generalizations. So, we have to be careful with these interpretations, and this is a matter we'll come back to later. For now, let's keep our eye on Lebanon, on Aziru, Rebadi, and the chaos sweeping the region. The warriors of Amurru continued their raids into Sumer, and the mayor of Byblos continued to wait. While Rebadi dispatched his many letters, business elsewhere carried on. The Egyptian officials, the men on the ground administering the empire, were not complacent, nor were they lazy. They moved about constantly, checking in with different rulers and communities, and responding to the demands of their king and their allies. One of these governors now comes to our attention, for he confronted Aziru directly. In several letters from different sources, local leaders refer to an official that they call Paweru. This is a rendering of the Egyptian Pawer, meaning the great or the great one. It could be a name or it could be a title. If it's a name, well, Paweru must have had pretty audacious parents. If it's a title, then it's another instance of the Canaanites misreading an Egyptian word. For the sake of the story, we'll assume that it's the guy's name. Paweru, an Egyptian commissioner, appeared in the wake of his predecessor's death. He showed up in various parts of Canaan, visiting towns that you might recognize. Letters from the Canaanite vassals show Paweru visiting places like Gaza and Ashkelon, or Chazati and Ashkeluna in the local tongue. He also went to Jerusalem, or Urusalim, and met its ruler, a man named Abdi Kheba. The Egyptian commissioner Paweru also came to Aziru's residence, and the new lord of Amurru reported this to the pharaoh. Quote, "To the king, message of Aziru, I fall at the feet of the king," etc., etc. "O king, my lord, Paweru, the archer commander of the king, has reached me. Paweru knows my loyalty, and may the sun, the king, my lord, ask him about it. And whatever the request of the sun god, the king, I will do it." End quote. The visit of an Egyptian official did not seem to cause Aziru too much worry. The prince stuck to his guns, maintaining his claims of loyalty. Even as events around his kingdom spoke otherwise, Aziru was persistent in assuring that he was the pharaoh's loyal servant. Somehow this seems to have worked, and we do not hear anything about Paweru castigating or punishing Aziru for what he was doing. Again, it's not clear what we should make of this. Perhaps the local situation was more complicated than we know. Perhaps Paweru was satisfied with what he saw during his visit. Or perhaps the visit actually took place before these events began. Again, we simply can't be sure. One way or another, Aziru was able to expand his kingdom while maintaining a public image of loyalty. Was the pharaoh convinced of this, or was he biding his time, waiting until Aziru slipped up and punishment could begin? Only time would tell, and we will tackle that very large topic in a future episode. For his own part, Aziru apparently thought that he was successful. When Paweru left his kingdom and went off to visit a neighboring area, Aziru and his brothers continued their plotting. Soon after, they took an incredibly bold step. After visiting Aziru and receiving assurances of his loyalty, the commissioner Paweru went to the town of Sumer. Sumer was still being raided, even besieged by Aziru's warriors, but Paweru was able to enter the town and meet with its leaders. What followed is a murky but curious little incident. One of Sumer's leaders, an Egyptian commissioner named Hapi, may have felt that the city should surrender. The town was surrounded, and it seemed like no help was coming from Egypt. Perhaps it would be better to let Aziru command the city peacefully, rather than risk the destruction which would surely follow if he took it by force. Hapi, and perhaps others, tried to push Paweru towards surrender. Paweru refused. He would not go against the pharaoh so blatantly. Whether that was loyalty or fear of reprisal or both is unclear. What is clear is that soon after the debate ended, Paweru's life came to its end. The Egyptian commissioner was assassinated. A letter from Rebadi, mayor of Byblos, reports very briefly what happened. He said, quote, "Paweru did not give the town of Sumer to the Apiru men, and so he was buried." End quote. In another message, Rebadi blamed the murder directly on Aziru and his brothers. He said, quote, "May the king, my lord, not leave this year free for the sons of Abdi Ashirta, for you know all of their acts of hatred. Who are they that they have committed a crime and killed the commissioner Paweru?" End quote. It's unclear exactly what happened here. Rebadi's first letter suggests that Paweru died because he refused to surrender his town. The second letter lays the blame more directly at the hands of Aziru and his brothers. Both of these might be true from different points of view. If Paweru died because he would not surrender, then the fact that his surrender was necessary is a result of Aziru's actions. Alternatively, if Paweru was killed by Aziru's warriors, their deeds were the responsibility of their leaders. Either way, it was Aziru and his brothers that created the conditions in which Paweru died, so they are responsible however you look at it. When Paweru died, the city that he was guarding, Sumer, opened its gates and surrendered. Aziru and his brothers took possession of the town, and the last holdout capitulated to their rule. At this moment, the sons of Abdi Ashirta re-established the kingdom their father had lost for good. Amurru was stronger than ever. We now come to the end of Chapter 2. Up next, the crisis in Lebanon reaches its peak again. Sumer has fallen. Everything Rebadi feared has come to pass. With the Egyptian bastion out of the way, the lords of Amurru would surely turn their attention to Byblos. Pharaoh must decide what to do. Rebadi must prepare for war, and if the mayor of Byblos does not get help, he will soon find himself under siege. Join me after the break for Chapter 3. See you in a moment. The year was approximately 1350 BCE. It was a dark time for Lebanon. The kingdom of Amurru was back, resurgent under the leadership of Aziru and his brothers. The sons of Abdi Ashirta had restored their father's territory, and now they turned their eye to Abdi's great rival. The city of Byblos and its leader Rebadi were the next logical target. Rebadi had sent many letters to the pharaoh, both Akhenaten and his father Amunhotep III before. He had alerted them to the threats that Amurru posed. Many times he had been disappointed in the response. The kings of Egypt had either ignored his pleas or given terse replies, belittling Rebadi for his alarmism and wishing that he would be quiet. Now, though, the mayor of Byblos was about to get some good news. Aziru and his brothers had committed a terrible act. Their siege of Sumer had resulted in the murder of an Egyptian official, the assassination of the commissioner Paweru. As a result of Paweru's death, the city that he guarded, Sumer, had opened its gates and surrendered. This deed was beyond anything that the Amurrites had done before, and it demanded an Egyptian response. To Rebadi's great excitement, that response would be an army. Not long after the murder of Paweru, Rebadi heard news that a company, pedjet of Egyptian soldiers was on their way. He was overjoyed, and he said, quote, "I have heard the words of the king, my lord, and my heart is overjoyed. May my lord hasten the sending of the archers with all speed. Who will resist the troops of the king?" End quote. Rabadi may have been excited, but it looks as though the promised troops never arrived. They may have been waylaid, or perhaps they never departed, or perhaps they departed, but for a different destination entirely. We can't be sure, but it seems that Rabadi followed up, sending an ambassador to Egypt to ask for the troops. Sadly, his ambassador returned empty-handed. The troops of Egypt remained in Egypt. Rabadi had failed to gain the military support he would need. When this happened, despair settled over the leadership of Byblos, and it wasn't long before members of Rabadi's court started whispering surrender. Rabadi was now an old man. He had ruled many years, and he had witnessed some truly historical days. As leader of the greatest city in Lebanon, heir to a long friendship with Egypt, Rabadi of Byblos might have expected to rule forever. Of course, all things pass, and so it was with him. Only Rabadi did not die naturally. No, that would be too kind to the man that had seen so much. Instead, Rabadi had to endure one final trial before his life could come to its end. In his twilight years, the mayor of Byblos was the victim of a coup. Sometime around 1350 BCE, give or take, Rabadi's career as the ruler of Byblos came to its end. The fall was sudden. When the mayor was out of the city visiting a neighbor, members of his family took control of the palace, barred the gates, and declared themselves in charge. When Rabadi returned to his home, he found himself exiled from his city. Overnight, one of Egypt's loyalist vassals was out of the game. Apparently, the conspirators acted out of fear of Aziru and the Amurrites, fear that their town would be the next target of rampaging warriors. We hear this from Rabadi himself, who, after his exile, promptly wrote to the pharaoh recounting what had happened. In Rabadi's version of events, the coup went as follows. Quote, "To the king, my lord, the message of Rabadi, your servant, the dirt at your feet. At the feet of the king, my lord, 7 times and 7 times have I fallen. May the king heed the words of his servant. Previously, the men of Byblos and my wife kept saying to me, 'Follow the sons of Abdi Ashirta so that we can make peace between us.' But I refused. I did not listen to them. When the pressure got too tough for me, then I thought to myself, 'Let me make a treaty with Amunhotep.' So I went to his house in order that I could make a treaty between us. But when I returned to my house, he, my brother, had locked me out. So may the king, my lord, take counsel concerning his servant. Day and night I wait for the regular army of the king. So may the king take counsel, because I have no other attitude. For the king I would die, so may the king give life to his servant. Furthermore, my 2 sons and 2 wives, they have been handed over to the rebel against the king." End quote. Rabadi may have described events in a way that made him look as good as possible. An act of treachery, sudden and unexpected, didn't exactly promise great things about his competency. So the former mayor of Byblos made it clear that his fall and exile were the product of fear, his own family members hoping to make peace with Aziru. It wasn't his fault, it was their cowardice that led to these events. Also, Rabadi had some thoughts about the role of Pharaoh in all of this. In another letter, he suggested some reasons why, maybe, the king of Egypt was also responsible for what had happened. In a rather brazen but desperate message, Rabadi said, quote, "Rabadi speaks to the king, my lord. I have repeatedly written for garrison troops, but they have not been given, and the king has not heeded the words of his servant. So I sent my ambassador to the royal palace, but he returned empty-handed. He had no garrison troops. And when the men of my city saw that you did not even send silver to me, like you send to my colleagues, then they, the men of Byblos, reviled me. Moreover, when I had gone to visit Amunhotep, my younger brother alienated the city of Byblos. He did this in order to give the city to the sons of Abdi-Ashirta. Thus, treason was committed, and my brother expelled me from the city. May the king, my lord, not keep silent concerning the deeds of this dog." End quote. It seems like, from Rabadi's perspective, the king of Egypt's failure to support him had come to its logical outcome. If Egyptian troops had been present, surely the Amurrites would never have dared attack him. If the pharaoh had given silver, like he sent to so many other vassals, then at least Rabadi could maintain his prestige. It seems that Rabadi's position had deteriorated, and lacking pharaoh's support, he had finally lost his power. In a situation like this, with his home gone, you might expect Rabadi to have visited Egypt directly. Sadly, the former mayor of Byblos was too old, and he was suffering from illness as well. So, begging Pharaoh's pardon, Rabadi sent one of his sons in his stead. The young man carried his father's message, which continued as follows, quote, "Now I am unable to enter the lands of Egypt. I have grown old, and the disease is strong in my body. And the king, my lord, knows that the gods of the city of Byblos are holy. The illness is strong because I have committed my sins against the gods. Thus I do not enter the presence of the king, my lord. I hereby send my own son into the presence of the king. May the king hear the words of his servant, and may he grant soldiers so that they may retake the city of Byblos. There are many men in Byblos that support me, few are rebels within. When the pharaoh's troops come forth and the men hear it, then the city will return to the king, my lord." End quote. I am no politician, but when Rabadi says that he is too sick and too old to travel, that doesn't fill me with confidence in his ability to rule. A man of his age, surely, was not long for this world. Whether by enemy blades or natural pestilence, Rabadi's life would probably be coming to its end sooner rather than later. If I were making the call on whether to send troops in aid of such a man, well, it would be difficult to have confidence that everything would work out. After all, who is to say that Rabadi would still be alive a year, a month, or even a week from now? The former mayor of Byblos was loyal to Egypt, and such things are precious in the world of politics. Nevertheless, the last letters of Rabadi paint a somewhat pitiful picture of a man who has lost everything and has not the strength to regain it. As a last resort, Rabadi was willing to bargain. Byblos was rich in gold and silver, and the property of its temples was lucrative. Surely, if the Egyptians reclaimed the city, then all of that could be theirs. Just let Rabadi have his town back. Quote, "May my lord know that I would die for him. When I was in the city, I guarded it for my lord, and my heart was devoted to the king. It was not my heart that gave the city to the sons of Abdi-Ashirta. May the king, my lord, not turn away from his city. It is very great in silver and gold. There is much property belonging to the temple of its gods. If the king, my lord, seizes the city, he may do with his servant whatever he will. For this may he grant the city of Byblos as my dwelling." End quote. Despite the promises of wealth, the Egyptian government did not act. Rabadi waited for over a year, hoping that Pharaoh's troops would come to his aid. He wrote another long letter to the king, explaining what had happened, and reassuring the pharaoh that people in Byblos were still loyal to him. If only Egyptian troops would appear, they would take Rabadi back, and the city would be restored. If only. Sadly, no help came. Perhaps the pharaoh was preoccupied with other conflicts. Perhaps he was not overly concerned about the loss of one vassal. If Aziru had convinced the Egyptian court that he was a loyal servant, then Rabadi may have fallen out of favor. After all, from one perspective, Rabadi's reign in Byblos was a long tenure of complaints, with little decisive action to show for it. The mayor had sent letter after letter after letter, nagging the pharaoh for more resources, and consistently showing that he was incapable of defending his own territory. With parts of the Near East racked by conflict, and the Hittites growing in power, Akhenaten's officials may have preferred that Lebanon be led by a strong prince. Either way, the Egyptians did not send an army. Rabadi waited in vain. What happened next is unclear, but it seems that Rabadi travelled to the town of Sidon. Sidon is about 40 kilometers south of Beirut and is one of Lebanon's largest cities today. Unfortunately, Sidon was ruled by friends of Amurru and the sons of Abdi Ashirta. Soon after he arrived, Rabadi died. Most likely, he was murdered. The last days of Rabadi's life are murky at best, but they reveal the extent of his desperation. Exiled from his home and seemingly abandoned by Egypt, the former mayor of Byblos spent more than a year living in different towns. Eventually, his determination broke down and his loyalty to Pharaoh wavered. In order to regain his home, Rabadi was even willing to beg help from Amurru. Rabadi went to the town of Sidon, whose leaders had made peace with the Amurrites. There, he apparently wrote a letter to Aziru, promising to give him wealth if the prince made him mayor of Byblos once more. The letter allegedly said, quote, "Take me and get me into my city. There is much silver there, and I will give it to you. Indeed, there is an abundance of everything, but not with me at the moment." End quote. This letter does not come from Rabadi directly. It is a second-hand report. If the quote is accurate, it is a major revelation. In his last days, the exiled mayor of Byblos was willing to treat even with his enemy if it meant regaining his home. That is quite the turnaround from his earlier defiance. I guess hard times will whittle down even the strongest of commitments. With no help coming from Egypt, Rabadi perhaps saw no other option. He asked Aziru to restore his authority. Aziru did not help Rabadi. Instead, he allowed the rulers of Sidon to do with the mayor as they saw fit. Soon after, Rabadi was dead, and the circumstances point pretty strongly to murder. It was a sad end for a once devoted servant. Rabadi was dead. His city had surrendered to Aziru and his brothers, and with this coup, the career of a prominent Egyptian vassal came to its end. Rabadi's tale is somewhat melancholy, and it may seem that his legacy would be the same. Was he a victim of circumstance, a failure in political terms, or simply one more casualty in an unusually chaotic time? It's hard to say for sure. At first glance, Rabadi's letters seem to paint a picture of doom and despair. The vassal wrote continuously to the pharaoh, complaining of issues in the region. He begged for assistance, lamented the failure of governors to tackle the Amurrite threat, and he cajoled the pharaohs to send troops. Rabadi's relationship with Amunhotep III and then Akhenaten is difficult to untangle. The Amarna letters tend to show the messages to the pharaoh. There are very few copies of the royal replies. We know that the Egyptians made these copies, but it seems that the Amarna letters are the ones left behind when the government moved away from Akhenaten's city. Apparently, the scribes responsible for royal correspondence kept many messages that were sent by the king, but discarded many that he had received, particularly the ones that were out of date by the time the city was abandoned. So we probably have most of Rabadi's messages, but none of the pharaoh's replies. Because of this selective discarding, we do not know much about the royal attitude to their vassal in Byblos. We got a glimpse of it in Chapter 2 when the pharaoh, apparently, complained about how many messages Rabadi was sending and how often he was complaining. Was that the king's general attitude, that Rabadi was a nuisance? Or was it a rare outburst at a stressful time? Again, we can't be sure, so we have to be careful before we judge Rabadi harshly or assume that Egypt did not care about him. As for Rebadi himself, he may seem like a political hypochondriac, the sort of boy who cried wolf, and that was a common description of him in earlier scholarship. Nowadays, more recent studies focusing on the language of Rebadi's letters and the patterns of his messages suggest that the ruler was actually more cunning than he may seem. Rebadi was not shooting from the hip, as it were. He didn't fire off letters without thinking it through carefully. Instead, the mayor of Byblos crafted his messages and his language to each situation, and particularly to what he was trying to achieve. Sometimes the mayor was more interested in demonstrating his loyalty and his service, and proving that he was a much better vassal than those other Canaanite rulers. At other times, Rebadi crafted his words in order to gain a reward, whether he was asking for soldiers, grain, or simply friendly acknowledgement. The mayor altered his grammar and syntax to get what he desired out of a situation. So Rebadi was not necessarily some panicky alarmist. He had his own goals, and he pursued these in various ways. Bearing that in mind, it is true that Rebadi's rule over Byblos ended in a form of political failure. The coup which toppled him from within his own family was a disappointing end for one who had survived dangerous times. Your reading of this situation will probably depend on your own values and how you view political relationships. From one perspective, Rebadi might be a fool to oppose Aziru and not make a profitable peace. From another perspective, Rebadi might have been a fool to break his relationship with the pharaoh. To go against Egypt would have been dangerous in a whole other way. I'll leave it to you to decide which one you prefer. So, after many years of loyal service, the mayor of Byblos, Rebadi, was dead. He was buried, perhaps by his son, and his soul passed to the afterlife. In the kingdom of Nergal, Rebadi joined many who had lost their lives in these dark days. I hope that he found rest. The fall of Rebadi was yet another entry in the long list of crimes that we lay at the doors of Aziru. The son of Abdi Ashirta and his brothers had gone further than their father ever dreamed. Their ambitions are clear in their deeds, and their treachery seems far more brazen. For every leader that they cajoled to their side, every town they isolated or attacked, for every vassal and Egyptian commissioner whose death they caused, Aziru and his kin crossed one line after another. Whether they saw themselves as genuine servants of the pharaoh or former vassals striking out for independence, the deeds of these men are a black mark on the history of Egypt's empire. Surprisingly, these tumultuous events would not mark the end of their careers. The sons of Abdi Ashirta would continue their work and take the political fallout as it came. And now, Chapter 3 in the Amurrite story, in which Aziru undertakes his greatest betrayal. In the last years of Akhenaten, a small kingdom in Lebanon was causing trouble. Amurru, near the Mediterranean coast, had caused many headaches for their neighbours. The rulers of this territory had raided towns, captured booty, and even murdered an Egyptian official. Basically, this kingdom went rogue, raising chaos and challenging the status quo. We have visited Amurru before. Previously, we saw how the rulers of Amurru tried to expand their power at the expense of others in this region. The lords of Amurru took advantage of a kind of light hand in Egyptian diplomacy. The pharaoh of Egypt was staying back from the internal politics of the region, and lords like Abdi Ashirta and his son Aziru used that opportunity to increase their power. By now, Abdi Ashirta was long dead. Aziru was in charge of the kingdom. And as the last years of Akhenaten began, Aziru entered the final chapter of his story. Up until now, it seems like the Egyptians were not getting that involved. But just before his death, Akhenaten did start to deal with this problem. The king of Egypt had been quiet for some time, but now he took action. In the later years of his reign, Akhenaten summoned Aziru, lord of Amurru, to visit him in Egypt. The king wanted to see Aziru, to speak with him, and to receive his explanation. Aziru and his kingdom had been naughty. Now, the pharaoh was finally investigating. One of the Amarna letters preserves a message that Akhenaten, king of Egypt, sent to his vassal. The fact that we have this letter is quite remarkable. For the most part, the Amarna archive preserves messages from foreigners to the king. The replies that Akhenaten sent don't survive as often. So in this letter, we actually get to hear what Akhenaten said. The message read, quote, "Speak to Aziru, the ruler of the city of Amurru. Thus says the king, your lord, as follows. The king, the pharaoh, has heard reports saying that, quote, Aziru is on good terms with the ruler of Kadesh. You have been taking food and strong drink in friendship with Kadesh. Is this true? Why are you doing this? Why are you on good terms with a ruler at whom the king is angry? If you have behaved honestly, then you will see that your relationship with me and Kadesh's relationship with me are incompatible. You are not trusting in the things that you used to trust before. What happened to you that you are not on the side of the king?" End quote. Akhenaten had a problem. It seemed that Aziru was being friendly with the lord of Kadesh. Kadesh was a fortress city to the east of Canaan, and currently the ruler of Kadesh seemed to be allying with foreign powers. Kadesh had become an enemy of Egypt. They were attacking the pharaoh's interests. So Akhenaten was in conflict with Kadesh. Yet, despite this obvious problem, Aziru was treating Kadesh as a friend. Frustrated, Akhenaten demanded answers. If Aziru was truly loyal to Egypt, he could not be friends with Kadesh as well. Akhenaten continued, quote, "Look at these enemies about whom I must inform you. They are seeking to cast you into the flames, but you love property, wealth, too much. If you accept servitude to the king, your lord, what would the king not do for you? Render service to the king, and you will live. But if you prefer treachery, because you desire wealth, and if you harbor disloyalty in your heart, then by the king's axe you will die, with all of your family. And you know that the king does not desire to come to the land of Canaan when he is angry." End quote. Aziru should not make Akhenaten angry. He would not like him when he is angry. And Pharaoh tried to communicate this. He promised friendship if Aziru was loyal, and vengeance if he was not. Akhenaten could see that Aziru was tempted by opportunities. The ruler of Amurru could possibly gain a lot of wealth if he broke away and joined rebellious forces. Treasure, plunder, territory, these were surely tempting. But if Aziru should betray, then Akhenaten promised fire and fury. To round out his letter, Akhenaten presented a set of demands. Quote, "Now the king, your lord, has sent to you the names of his enemies. So send these people to the king, your lord. Do not leave even one of them out. May bronze shackles be put on these enemies' feet. Behold, the men whom you must deliver are Sharu with all of his sons, Tuya, Leah with all of his sons, Pishiari with all of his sons, the son-in-law of Manya with his sons and his wives, the warrior who knows sacrilege, he who always insults the foreigner, Dasharti, Baal-Uma, Nimaxi, the robber in the land of Amurru. May you know that all is well with the king, like the sun god in heaven. His troops and chariots are numerous, from the southland to the northland. It is all very well." End quote. Akhenaten had a list, a group of people whom he considered to be enemies. Apparently, the king of Egypt had a good idea of who exactly was causing trouble, and he demanded that Aziru turn these men and their families over. The prisoners should come in chains, captives of the king. And just to remind Aziru, Akhenaten signed off, saying that he had many chariots and many soldiers. The message was clear: submit, or I will come for you. Akhenaten's threats against Aziru are a fascinating glimpse at the pharaoh's personality. Obviously, the message has been filtered through layers of translation. First, translated from Egyptian to Akkadian, and then from Akkadian to English. So many of the nuances are probably lost. But the image of Akhenaten, stern and commanding, issuing his orders for a distant vassal, that is compelling. Whether he had the power to enforce this or not is another matter. Akhenaten, the pharaoh of Egypt, demanded that Aziru send him prisoners, hostages, individuals and their families who were on an enemy's list. Would Aziru comply with this demand? Well, we do not have a copy of Aziru's reply to this message, so we don't know if he did send the prisoners or if he tried to get around it. What we do know is that soon after this, Akhenaten demanded that Aziru himself should visit Egypt. It seems that Pharaoh's patience began to run out, and soon he wanted to speak to Aziru directly. The Lord of Amurru, though, was slippery. In his next few letters, he repeatedly delays his obligations to the king. Aziru promises that soon he will visit Egypt, but at the moment, circumstances prevent his obedience. According to Aziru, he would love to visit Akhenaten and give his loyalty in person. But he couldn't do that right at this moment. We hear from Aziru, quote, "Message to Tutu, my lord, my father. The message of Aziru, your servant. At the feet of my lord I have fallen. The Egyptian named Hatip has come, and he has brought the lovely, sweet words of the king, my lord. I have rejoiced greatly to receive these words. The breath of the king, my lord, has come to me. Hatip is staying with me now, and he and I will come to Egypt together. But, my lord, the king of the land of Hatti has come to nearby realms, and I am unable to come just yet. Let the king of Hatti depart, and then I will come, along with Hatip." End quote. Aziru sent a message to a man named Tutu. Tutu is a royal official, a high-ranking member of Akhenaten's government. He was a powerful man with influence in foreign affairs, and he had a tomb at the city of Amarna. Aziru appealed directly to Tutu for a bit more time. According to Aziru, the reason he was not coming was quite simple. The king of Hatti was in the area. Apparently, Aziru was afraid of Suppiluliuma, the king of the Hittites. Suppiluliuma had swept through Syria and parts of Canaan in a devastating war that destroyed major kingdoms. Naturally, Aziru was afraid of Suppiluliuma. He was afraid of what would happen if he left his kingdom for any length of time. Coming to Egypt would take several weeks at least. If he did that, Aziru would leave Amurru vulnerable. Aziru's excuse might be genuine. The Hittites were active in this region around this time, and a trip to Egypt was a risky proposition any day of the week. So maybe his reasoning was legitimate. We can't quite be sure. What we do know is that eventually Aziru came through. He delayed for a while, and there are several messages promising to come very soon, just next week. I'm on my way, I swear. Well, eventually he did actually leave his kingdom. Aziru boarded a ship and came to Egypt. We don't know if Aziru actually met the pharaoh in person. Possibly he got to the capital city and found himself face to face with Tutu, the royal official, master of foreign affairs. Tutu certainly would have dealt with Aziru in some capacity. Maybe he debriefed him, maybe he punished him, and maybe he gave Aziru an audience with the king. Whatever happened exactly, the result was clear. Aziru came to Egypt, and soon he was trapped. For a while, the Egyptians kept Aziru as a hostage. He was detained at a royal palace or fort, and he was not permitted to go home. For several months, Aziru was a prisoner of the pharaoh, and for the ruler, this was the worst possible outcome. Aziru had feared to leave his homeland because of the Hittite threat. The king of Hatti, Suppiluliuma, was a great power in the north, and Aziru feared that the warriors of that kingdom would strike his home. Well, now he was stuck, far from that home, with no way to act. If the Hittites attacked Amurru while Aziru was trapped in Egypt, he would not know until the entire thing was over. How would he resolve this? Back in Amurru, modern-day Lebanon, Aziru's family got to work. His eldest son wrote letters to Egypt asking about his father. The prince of Amurru wrote a letter to Tutu, the high official, asking him to release Aziru. He said, quote, "To the king, my lord, etc., etc. Behold, in me there is no falsehood, no lie. You may keep me alive, or you may put me to death. To you alone do I look, my king. You alone are my lord. So may my lord heed his servant. Please do not delay Aziru, your servant, any longer. Send him back to Amurru immediately, so that he may guard the countries of the king, our lord. Moreover, to Tutu, my lord, other rulers have said to me, quote, 'You sold your father for gold to the king of Egypt. When will the pharaoh let your father leave Egypt?' Everyone around me has said to me, 'Aziru is not going to escape from Egypt.' Now, others are deserting the country, and I am repeatedly told, 'Your father is staying in Egypt, so we are going to wage war against you.' Listen, my lord, Tutu, let Aziru go immediately." End quote. A son of Aziru, now anonymous, begged for his father's return. Allegations were swirling around that the prince had sold his father out for gold. And with Aziru gone, some of their allies were leaving. Presumably, Aziru had gathered his army by recruiting different groups and tribes. Aziru would have made promises to local leaders and kept them loyal by dishing out rewards. Now, though, the Lord of Amurru was gone, and at the moment, it seemed like he wouldn't return. With that dark cloud hanging over them, the armies of Amurru might have started to dissolve. That might sound like a good thing, and in some respects it was, but at the same time, it was a problem. Aziru and his kingdom had become powerful. They had made themselves a potent force in the region. If this coalition, this army disintegrated, it would not just go back to the fields. Warriors, tribes, and leaders would start to raid and plunder. They would become brigands and cause further disruptions in the area. After all, when soldiers are promised payment and then let go without payment, well, they rarely go back to a life of peace. So Aziru's imprisonment was a problem. If he was kept in Egypt, the Lord of Amurru could not maintain control over his forces. If his troops disbanded, they would begin to cause further problems all around. In other words, if the pharaoh kept Aziru in Egypt, he might put out one fire, but at the same time, 100 smaller fires could start. The Egyptians could not let Aziru go, but nor could they keep him. What would they do? In the last years of Akhenaten, Aziru came to Egypt. The Lord of Amurru became a prisoner while the Egyptians decided what to do with him. In his absence, Amurru was vulnerable. If the situation did not resolve itself soon, there might be calamity. In Chapter 2, we explore the aftermath of this event. What happened to Aziru and his kingdom in the wake of his imprisonment? That is after the break. See you in a moment. Chapter 2. The year was 1350 BCE, approximately. The later years of Akhenaten, a time of disruption and difficulty for the Egyptian Empire. The pharaoh was having personal and political problems. In the north, some of his vassals were causing trouble. Now, Akhenaten's government had taken custody of Aziru. The lord of Amurru, the ruler of a small vassal kingdom, Aziru was being held in Egypt. This might be an issue because, to the north, Aziru's kingdom was under threat. This is where the Hittites enter the equation. By the time Aziru came to Egypt, the king of Hatti was raising hell in Syria. Suppiluliuma, the great king, had destroyed several states and subjugated many more. He had encouraged small kingdoms to defect or attack their neighbors. And over time, the Hittite web had stretched far and wide. By this point, Suppiluliuma had become a serious threat. So what would the pharaoh do? Would he let Aziru go so that he could protect and preserve the border? Or would Akhenaten attack the Hittites directly? Well, Pharaoh might have done both. In the last years of Akhenaten, letters from Canaanite rulers suggest that the Egyptians were preparing to attack. Messages from regional lords report preparations for an oncoming war. The kings were gathering supplies in order to support the pharaoh and his troops. One of these letters gives us quite a bit of detail. Quote, "To the king, my lord, message of Arzawuya, the ruler of the city of Rogisi. At the feet of my lord I have fallen. The king, my lord, has told me to prepare for the arrival of archers, soldiers of the king, and to prepare for the arrival of his many commissioners. Of course, I serve the king. May the soldiers of the king and his commissioners arrive. I will have prepared everything, and after they arrive, I will go wherever enemies oppose the king. We will take these enemies. We will hand the king's enemies over to him, our lord." End quote. Arzawuya, a local ruler, had his instructions. He should prepare for the arrival of an Egyptian army. Of course, the loyal vassal fell over himself to serve the pharaoh. He would give his full support to the king's soldiers and help them wherever they went. Other letters from different towns give us the same message. The Egyptians were preparing to march, and they expected their vassals to support them. This attack never materialized, or at least we do not have any record of it occurring. So what happened? It is possible that the Egyptian campaign was in the planning stages when Akhenaten died. These events around Amurru do seem to come towards the end of Akhenaten's reign. So maybe the king wanted to launch an attack, but passed away too soon. Alternatively, perhaps the attack did go ahead, but failed to make its objective. If the king sent troops into Canaan and they were unsuccessful, that might explain why we don't hear about it anymore. The Egyptian pharaohs do not like to broadcast their failures. It is unclear what happened exactly. Either way, it seems that the pharaoh did not manage to effect major change in the region. Either Akhenaten did not send the troops, or the troops that he did send failed to achieve their goal. At the end, the land of Canaan remained in turmoil. Through all of this, Aziru was still a factor. The Lord of Amurru had become a prisoner in Egypt. What would the king do with him? At some point, Akhenaten freed Aziru and allowed him to return home. This could have been a practical consideration. Aziru was powerful, and he had the loyalty of many warriors. At the same time, Aziru might have been the only person who could maintain order. So maybe Aziru was too important to fail. The Egyptians released him, and he went home. Aziru hopped on a ship and sailed north. He travelled from the Egyptian delta to the coast of Lebanon. He disembarked at a harbour, possibly the town of Sumer. Then he went home to his city and began to deal with his kingdom. Aziru was back in power thanks to the pharaoh's forgiveness. Unfortunately, he was not happy about it. Having been imprisoned, Aziru was clearly holding a grudge, for not long after his return, the Lord of Amurru was in contact with Egypt's enemies. He started talking to the Hittites. In the final years of Akhenaten, or slightly afterwards, Aziru began to write to Egypt's enemies. He got in touch with Suppiluliuma, the king of the land of Hittite. And pretty soon, Aziru and Suppiluliuma made a deal. We know this because texts from the Hittite royal archives preserve a treaty between the two kingdoms. Archaeologists working in the ancient Hittite capital have recovered thousands of tablets and documents. Archives from the Hittite palace record the deeds, prayers, the memoirs, and the diplomacy of their rulers. Among the many, many texts, one in particular stands out. It contains a treaty between Suppiluliuma and Aziru, Lord of Amurru. The agreement was simple. It connected Aziru and Suppiluliuma as vassal and overlord. The king of Hittite would protect Aziru. He would give him shelter as a subject of his empire. Aziru would obey Suppiluliuma and do whatever he asked. This treaty was sealed before witnesses and gods. It said, quote, "Thus speaks my majesty, Suppiluliuma, the great king, the king of Hittite, the hero, beloved of the storm god. I, my majesty, have taken you, Aziru, as my subject, and I have placed upon you the throne of your father. If you, Aziru, do not protect the king of Hittite, your lord, you will violate your oath. As your soul, your body, your wives, your sons, and your land are dear to you, so may the soul of the king, the body of the king, and the land of Hittite be equally dear to you. Your tribute will be 300 shekels of gold, top quality, every year. You shall weigh this gold according to the weights used by the merchants of Hittite. You, Aziru, must come to my majesty, your lord, every single year." End quote. The oath was simple but hefty. A yearly tribute of 300 golden shekels. In the Hittite kingdom, a shekel was approximately 12 grams of metal. So 300 shekels was 3,600 grams of gold. It is exceptionally difficult to convert ancient currencies to modern. But if we take the really simple approach, at the time I'm recording this, gold is trading at approximately $60 per gram. So the annual tribute was worth about $216,000. That might not sound like much, but it was a huge outlay. Aziru had to provide that amount every single year. Aziru was paying Suppiluliuma a lot for his friendship. What was he getting in return? Well, it's not exactly clear. The surviving parts of the treaty mostly tell us what the Hittite ruler demanded. The text goes on and on about what Aziru will do for Suppiluliuma. Aziru will send tribute. He will assist in times of war. He will return any fugitives or runaways. He will always speak in favor of Hati and never go against them. He will obey the great king, and if he breaks any of these oaths, he will suffer the curses of the gods. In return, well, there isn't much. In exchange for Aziru's gifts and his loyalty, Suppiluliuma will graciously send warriors and noblemen to the cities of Amurru. Chariots and soldiers will come to Aziru's towns, for his protection, of course, and Aziru will treat these warriors, these nobles, like family. Frankly, it kind of sounds like a protection racket, like the deal was getting worse all the time. Hopefully, Suppiluliuma did not alter the treaty any further. So, the king of Hati made a treaty with Aziru, ruler of Amurru. This treaty does not sound particularly generous or even helpful for Aziru himself. So why would he agree to it? Well, I think we can assume that Aziru accepted this treaty out of fear. Fear of the Hittites, fear of what Suppiluliuma could do, and perhaps fear that Egypt, the pharaoh, might attack him for his crimes. After all, Aziru and his father had spent years breaking one rule after another. At some point there would be a reckoning. Maybe Aziru accepted this treaty because he was afraid not to accept it. The Amurrite lord, Aziru, and the king of Hati, Suppiluliuma, signed their treaty. To formalize the agreement, the great king summoned the gods themselves as witnesses. In the final sections of the text, we learn how Suppiluliuma guaranteed these promises. The king said, quote, "I, Suppiluliuma, have summoned the 1,000 gods to assemble for this oath, and I have called them as witnesses. Great gods including Huwasana, Tapisuwa, Kuni Yawani, the mountain dweller gods, the mercenary gods, Erish Kigal, all the male deities and female deities of Hati, all the male deities and female deities of Amurru, all the primeval deities like Nara, Namsara, Minki, Tuhusi, Amunki, Amizadu, Alalu, Antu, Anu, Apantu, Enlil, Ninlil, the mountains, the rivers, the springs, the sea, heaven and earth, the winds and the clouds. They all shall be witnesses to this treaty and oath." End quote. Now that is how you formalize an agreement. Suppiluliuma called on the very powers of sky, water, earth, and wind as his witnesses. Great gods, some of the most powerful beings in the world, would guarantee this treaty. I wonder if Aziru was a pious man, and if so, how he felt about that kind of deal. Aziru betrayed Egypt. He abandoned his oaths to the pharaoh, and he threw in with the king of Hati. Overnight, the political situation changed. Amurru was no longer a friend of Egypt. Now it was an enemy. They had broken away from the Egyptian empire. The map in Syria and Canaan was changing. The balance of power was shifting. For the pharaoh, the political situation was deteriorating. All of this took place in the final years of Akhenaten, possibly the short reign of his successor, Nefer-Neferu-Aten. The exact chronology is unclear, but we do know that by the time King Tutankhamun came to power, the northern borders of the empire were fragmenting. A lot of that was due to Aziru. The lord of Amurru, Aziru was a ruthless politician. He inherited a kingdom in difficulty after his father was executed by the Egyptians. And yet, against the odds, Aziru rebuilt the power of his household and resumed their earlier plans. Over the next decade or so, Aziru managed to effect significant changes and events in his neighborhood. To be clear, most of the information we have about Aziru is negative. Other rulers complain about him and warn the pharaoh of his machinations. They report his crimes and urge the king to destroy him. Some of these letters may be honest appraisals of Aziru. Others might exaggerate the problem. Either way, the end result is clear. Aziru was a cunning ruler who navigated a tumultuous period. He might have caused many of those upheavals himself, but he stayed in power for a long time, and eventually, he even faced the Egyptians directly. He was imprisoned for a time, and yet they set him free. And when Aziru returned to his kingdom, he made the final decision. Aziru betrayed Egypt and joined the Hittite Empire. He would remain their servant for years to come. That brings us to the end of the rise of Amurru. From here on, Sety I would lead his campaign, and he would, supposedly, conquer and subjugate the region once more. Amurru's tale is not finished. They will appear again in our story to come. But for now, the kingdom has returned to its place in the Egyptian empire. The pharaoh Sety I has undone Aziru's crime.